Hello everyone. Tonight, I've prepared a special compilation of trucker tales, all gathered into one soothing episode for you to enjoy. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It really helps support the channel. Now, let's begin. The Red Ink Special from Jake Morrison. The CB radio had been crackling with static for the better part of 3 hours as I guided my Peterbilt through the winding mountain roads of eastern Oregon. The autumn rain drummed a steady rhythm against my windshield, and the wipers fought a losing battle against the downpour that seemed determined to wash the world clean. My headlights carved narrow tunnels through the darkness, illuminating nothing but wet asphalt and the occasional reflective mile marker that flashed past like a ghost's warning. I'd been driving these roads for 15 years, hauling everything from lumber to electronics across the Pacific Northwest, but tonight felt different somehow. The familiar weight of my trailer behind me seemed heavier than usual, though I knew the manifest by heart. Office furniture bound for Portland, nothing more exotic than filing cabinets and desk chairs. Still, something in the air itself felt thick, almost expectant, as if the mountain darkness was holding its breath. The fuel gauge had been flirting with the quarter-tank mark for the last 50 miles, and my stomach reminded me that the gas station sandwich I'd grabbed in Bend was a distant memory. When the neon glow of Mama's all-night diner appeared through the rain like a beacon, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. The sign flickered intermittently, casting everything in alternating shades of pink and shadow, but it was warm light nonetheless, and that was enough. The parking lot was mostly empty save for a couple of beat-up sedans and what looked like a delivery truck from the local bakery. I pulled my rig into the space reserved for truck parking, the air brakes hissing their familiar sigh as I settled the beast for what I hoped would be a quick meal and fuel stop. The diner itself was one of those classic aluminum affairs from the 1950s, all curved edges and chrome trim that had probably been gleaming when Eisenhower was president, but now showed the patina of decades weathering mountain winters. The bell above the door chimed as I stepped inside, and immediately I was enveloped in the comforting atmosphere of bacon grease, coffee, and that particular blend of cleaning solution and worn vinyl that every truck stop diner seems to share. The interior was exactly what I'd expected. Red vinyl booths with duct tape repairs, a long counter with spinning stools, and a pie case that probably hadn't been updated since the Carter administration. A few locals sat scattered around, nursing coffee cups and speaking in the low murmurs that late-night diners seem to inspire. The waitress who approached me was probably in her 50s, with graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and the kind of comfortable shoes that spoke of long shifts on linoleum floors. Her name tag read Dolores in faded letters, and her smile seemed genuine enough, though something about her eyes struck me as oddly distant, as if she was looking through me rather than at me. "Evening, honey," she said, her voice carrying the slight rasp of a longtime smoker. "Just you tonight? Take any seat you like, we're not exactly packed." She gestured toward the empty expanse of the diner with a slight laugh that didn't quite reach her eyes. I slid into a booth near the window where I could keep an eye on my truck, the vinyl squeaking slightly under my weight. The rain continued its assault on the glass beside me, creating rivulets that caught and scattered the diner's neon glow into abstract patterns. Dolores appeared almost immediately with a coffee pot and a menu, filling the thick ceramic mug in front of me with practiced efficiency. "Coffee's fresh," she said, though the dark liquid looked like it had been brewing since the Clinton years. "Special tonight is the meatloaf, comes with mashed potatoes and green beans. Most folks seem to like it well enough." I nodded and took the menu from her, expecting the usual laminated affair with photographs of improbably perfect burgers and pie slices. Instead, what she handed me was a single sheet of paper, slightly damp to the touch and covered in what appeared to be handwritten text. The writing was in red ink, dark and bold, with an odd consistency that made some letters appear to bleed slightly into the paper's fibers. "Take your time, hon," Dolores said, already turning away. "Kitchen's open all night, so no rush." I lifted the coffee cup to my lips and immediately regretted it. The liquid was bitter beyond belief, with a metallic aftertaste that lingered unpleasantly on my tongue. Setting the cup aside, I turned my attention to the menu, squinting slightly in the diner's fluorescent lighting to make out the handwritten items. Hamburgers and cheeseburgers, various sandwich combinations, breakfast served all day, the usual diner fare. But as I read more carefully, I began to notice oddities in the descriptions that made my stomach tighten with unease. The traveler's special was described as ground fresh daily from our most recent visitors. The highway soup promised to be made with the finest ingredients from those who won't be needing them anymore. I blinked hard and read the descriptions again, certain that the dim lighting and my own fatigue were playing tricks on my eyes. But the words remained the same, written in that strange red ink that seemed to shimmer slightly in the fluorescent glow. The midnight plate offered selections from our walk-in cooler, aged to perfection. The stranger's sandwich was prepared with loving care from our special reserve. My hands trembled slightly as I held the menu, and I found myself looking around the diner with new eyes. The other customers sat motionless in their booths, their coffee cups untouched, their conversations reduced to silence. One man near the counter had his head tilted at an odd angle, as if he had fallen asleep mid-meal, but his eyes were open and staring at nothing. A woman in the corner booth held a newspaper in front of her face, but I realized she hadn't turned a page in the entire time I'd been watching. The bell above the door chimed again, and I turned to see another trucker entering, shaking rain from his jacket and looking around with the same grateful expression I'd worn just minutes before. He was younger than me, probably in his 30s, with the lean build and alert eyes of someone still new enough to the road to find adventure in every mile. Dolores approached him with the same distant smile, the same practiced routine, and guided him to a booth on the far side of the diner. I watched as she brought him coffee and handed him a menu identical to mine, the same red ink gleaming wetly in the light. He opened it with the casual confidence of someone expecting nothing more than prices for pie and directions to the restrooms, but I saw his expression change as he read. His brow furrowed, then his eyes widened slightly, and he looked up at Dolores with a question forming on his lips. "Is this some kind of joke?" I heard him ask, his voice carrying clearly in the suddenly quiet diner. "What's with all this weird writing?" Dolores tilted her head slightly, her smile never wavering. "I'm sorry, honey. What seems to be the problem? Everything on there is exactly as advertised." The young trucker held up his menu, pointing at the red text with a shaking finger. "This stuff about grinding up visitors and cooking strangers. It's sick. What the hell kind of place is this?" But instead of the red ink descriptions that had chilled me to the bone, I could see from my angle that his menu now showed perfectly normal text in standard black print. Hamburger described simply as quarter-pound beef patty with lettuce and tomato. Soup of the day listed as homemade chicken noodle. Nothing sinister, nothing threatening, just the mundane offerings of a roadside diner. I looked down at my own menu again, and the red ink seemed to pulse slightly, the words reshaping themselves as I watched. The driver's delight read one new entry, prepared especially for our friend Jake Morrison, seasoned with 15 years of highway experience. Below it, the Peterbilt platter promised everything a long-haul trucker could want, including his final destination. My blood turned to ice water in my veins as I read my own name written in that crimson script. I hadn't told anyone here my name, hadn't shown identification or signed anything. The menu seemed to grow warm in my hands, and I could swear the red ink was moving, flowing like liquid across the paper's surface. I stood up abruptly, the vinyl booth squeaking loudly in the sudden silence that had fallen over the diner. Every head turned toward me, including those of the customers I'd thought were sleeping or reading. Their eyes were completely black, reflecting the fluorescent lights like pools of oil, and their smiles were identical to Dolores's distant, predatory expression. The Road That Remembers Nothing, from Marcus Chen. The GPS died exactly 17 miles before I reached the toll plaza, its screen flickering once before going completely black, leaving me with nothing but the steady rumble of my Peterbilt and the yellow glow of sodium lights stretching into the Pennsylvania darkness. I'd been driving this route between Pittsburgh and Philadelphia for 8 years, hauling everything from furniture to farming equipment, but I'd never taken the Susquehanna bypass before. The dispatcher said it would save me 40 minutes, and with a delivery deadline looming at dawn, 40 minutes felt like a gift from heaven. The toll booth materialized out of the fog like something from an old photograph, its concrete structure weathered and stained with decades of exhaust and rain. Only one lane was open despite the late hour, which seemed odd for a major bypass, but I'd learned not to question the peculiarities of Pennsylvania's highway system. The attendant sat behind thick glass that reflected my headlights back at me, making it impossible to see his face clearly. I could make out the general shape of a person, hunched forward slightly, but the details seemed to swim and shift in the amber glow of the booth's interior lighting. I rolled down my window as I approached, the cool October air carrying the scent of wet leaves and something else, something metallic and stale that reminded me of old coins left in a pocket for too long. The attendant's voice crackled through the intercom with a quality that suggested the speakers had seen better decades. "Welcome to the Susquehanna bypass. That'll be $12 for commercial vehicles. I'll need your name for the receipt." Something about the way he said name made my skin crawl, though I couldn't pinpoint exactly why. Maybe it was the slight emphasis he placed on the word, or the way it seemed to hang in the air a moment longer than necessary. I reached for my wallet, fishing out a $20 bill. "Marcus Chen," I replied, spelling it out clearly as I did for most transactions. Years of dealing with mispronounced names had taught me the value of clarity. The attendant repeated it back to me, and again I felt that strange chill. "Marcus Chen. Yes, that's a fine name, a strong name. Been in your family long?" The question struck me as odd, but toll booth attendants were often lonely, eager for conversation during the quiet hours. I'd encountered chatty ones before, though usually not at 2 in the morning. "Family name, yeah," I said, handing over the 20. "My grandfather brought it over from Taiwan in the 50s. I wasn't sure why I was sharing personal details with a stranger, but something about the darkness and the isolation of the moment seemed to invite confession." The attendant took the bill, and I caught a glimpse of his hand as it disappeared into the booth. The skin looked pale, almost translucent in the artificial light, with veins that seemed darker than they should be. "Names carry history," he said, as he counted out my change. "Stories, power, they're precious things. Names are. People don't realize how precious until they're gone." I accepted my change and the receipt, noting that the paper felt unusually thick and rough, almost like parchment. The gate arm lifted with a mechanical wheeze that sounded like it needed maintenance, and I pulled forward onto the bypass proper. In my side mirror, I watched the toll plaza shrink into the fog, its lights becoming distant smudges in the darkness. The road stretched ahead in perfect straightness, cutting through hills that rose like sleeping giants on either side. My radio picked up nothing but static despite the clear weather, and even trucking channels that usually carried across state lines produced only white noise. The isolation felt complete, as if I were driving through a world separate from the one I'd left behind at the toll plaza. My CB radio remained similarly silent, which was unusual for a commercial route. Even at this hour, miles passed in a hypnotic rhythm marked only by the occasional reflector post, catching my headlights. I'd expected to see other vehicles, at least a few cars or maybe another truck, but the Susquehanna bypass seemed to belong entirely to me. The speedometer held steady at 65, my engine maintaining its familiar rumble, but something felt wrong in a way I couldn't articulate. It was like trying to remember a dream that slipped away even as you grasped for it. I reached for my logbook to note the toll payment, and realized I couldn't remember the attendant's appearance clearly. Had he been young or old, wearing a uniform? The details seemed to slide away from my memory like water off glass. Even stranger, when I tried to recall what name I'd given him, I found only a vague impression, like an echo of an echo. The first sign that something was seriously wrong came when I passed a state police cruiser parked on the shoulder, its occupant apparently running radar. I slowed automatically, checking my speed, but as I drew alongside the vehicle, I realized the officer was flagging me down. I pulled over, running through a mental checklist of possible violations. My permits were current, my logs up to date, and I hadn't been speeding. The trooper approached my cab with the measured stride of someone who'd done this thousands of times. He was middle-aged, with the kind of mustache that suggested decades of service, and his uniform looked properly official in every respect. "Evening, sir," he said as I rolled down my window. "License and registration, please, and I'll need your name." I handed over my documents, but when I opened my mouth to speak, nothing came out. Not because I was nervous or afraid, but because I literally could not remember my name. The knowledge that should have been as automatic as breathing simply wasn't there. I could remember my childhood, my family, my career, every detail of my life, except the most fundamental one. The absence felt like a physical wound, an emptiness where something vital had been torn away. "Sir?" the officer prompted, studying my license in his flashlight beam. "I asked for your name." I looked at the license in his hand, knowing it would provide the answer, but the text seemed to shift and blur before my eyes. The photograph was clearly mine, but where my name should have been, I saw only meaningless symbols that hurt to look at directly. "I can't remember," I managed to say, the words feeling strange in my mouth. The officer's expression changed, becoming something between pity and fear. He stepped closer to my cab, lowering his voice. "How far back did you come from, son?" "Pittsburgh," I said, grateful that I could remember at least that much. "I took the bypass to save time." "What bypass?" he asked, but his tone suggested he already knew the answer and didn't like it. "The Susquehanna bypass. I went through the toll plaza about 20 miles back." Even as I said it, the memory felt fragile, like a soap bubble that might pop at any moment. The officer closed his eyes and muttered something under his breath that sounded like a prayer. When he opened them again, his face had gone pale. "Son, there is no Susquehanna bypass. That road was closed permanently in 1987, after a series of accidents. The toll plaza was demolished 2 years later." I wanted to argue, to insist that he was wrong, but the certainty in his voice made my protests die before they could form. If what he was saying was true, then where had I been driving for the past hour? And why couldn't I remember my own name? "Listen to me very carefully," the officer continued, his voice urgent now. "You need to turn around right now and drive back the way you came. Don't stop. Don't look back. And whatever you do, don't go through that toll plaza again. Sometimes people find their way onto that road, and sometimes they find their way off. But they don't always come back complete." He handed my license back to me, but I still couldn't read the name on it. "What did I lose?" I asked, though I was afraid of the answer. "Could be worse," he said grimly. "Some folks lose more than names. Some lose their faces, their voices, their memories of loved ones. The road takes what the toll requires, and it's never satisfied with money." I started my engine with trembling hands, but as I prepared to make a U-turn, a terrible thought occurred to me. "Officer, what if I can't find my way back to the real world? What if I'm stuck on roads that don't exist?" He was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his words chilled me more than the October air. "Then you'd better hope you don't run out of fuel. The road feeds on travelers, but it's patient. It'll keep you going as long as you keep driving. Keep taking its toll. Just don't ever stop moving, son." Things that stop moving on phantom roads tend to become part of the scenery. I executed the turn and began retracing my route, watching the officer's lights disappear in my mirror. The drive back felt different, charged with a desperate energy that made my heart race. Every mile marker. The binding highway. From Marcus C. The rain had been falling steadily for 3 hours when I picked up the hitchhiker outside of Bakersfield, each droplet catching the amber glow of my headlights like tiny fragments of broken glass scattered across the asphalt. My 18-wheeler, a Kenworth T800 that had been my home away from home for the better part of a decade, hummed its familiar diesel lullaby as we cut through the California night toward the Oregon border. The CB radio crackled with static and distant voices of other drivers fighting through the same storm, their words fragmented and ghostly in the electric air. She had appeared at the edge of my high beams like something conjured from the darkness itself, standing perfectly still beside the broken guardrail where the highway curved around Eagles Point. No urgency in her posture, no frantic waving or desperate signaling that typically marked someone stranded on a night like this. Just a young woman in a pale dress that seemed untouched by the rain, her dark hair hanging straight and still despite the wind that had been buffeting my rig for miles. Something about her made me ease off the throttle and reach for the air brakes, though I couldn't say exactly what compelled me to stop. Company policy strictly prohibited picking up hitchhikers, and in my 10 years of hauling freight across the western states, I had passed by countless souls seeking rides without so much as a second glance. But this night felt different somehow. charged with an electricity that had nothing to do with the storm clouds overhead. Perhaps it was the isolation of the mountain highway, or the way the rain seemed to bend around her motionless figure. But I found myself guiding the massive truck to a gentle stop along the shoulder, the hydraulic hiss of the brakes mixing with the steady percussion of raindrops against my windshield. She climbed into the passenger seat with fluid grace, settling into the worn leather as if she had made this journey 1,000 times before. The cab's interior lighting cast strange shadows across her features, highlighting cheekbones that seemed almost too sharp and eyes that reflected the dashboard glow with an unusual intensity. When she spoke, her voice carried the soft cadence of someone accustomed to being heard without raising her tone, each word measured and precise in a way that suggested careful consideration rather than casual conversation. "Thank you for stopping," she said, reaching across her body to fasten the passenger seatbelt with deliberate movements. "Most drivers don't pause for strangers on nights like this." The belt clicked into place with a sound that seemed unusually loud in the confined space of the cab, and I noticed how perfectly it aligned across her slight frame, as if the safety mechanism had adjusted itself to accommodate her exact proportions without the usual fumbling that came with unfamiliar seating. I shifted the transmission back into drive and felt the 18 wheels grip the wet pavement as we rejoined the flow of late-night traffic, which consisted primarily of other long-haul truckers and the occasional passenger vehicle brave enough to navigate the mountain passes in such weather. The woman settled back into her seat with a contentment that struck me as oddly profound, her hands folded neatly in her lap, while her gaze remained fixed on the hypnotic sweep of the windshield wipers. For several miles we traveled in companionable silence, the only sounds being the steady rumble of the diesel engine and the rhythmic thrum of tires against wet asphalt. The first sign that something unusual was occurring came about 20 minutes into our shared journey, when I glanced toward the passenger seat during a routine mirror check and noticed that the seatbelt appeared to be sitting differently across her body. The chest strap, which had initially rested loosely against her pale dress, now seemed snug against the fabric, creating small creases that hadn't been there when she first buckled herself in. I attributed this to normal settling and adjustment, the kind of minor shifting that happens during any extended period of sitting, and returned my attention to the increasingly treacherous road ahead. The storm had intensified as we climbed higher into the mountain range, and the rain had taken on an almost aggressive quality, striking the windshield with enough force to create momentary blind spots between the sweeps of the wiper. The CB radio continued its intermittent chatter, with drivers reporting decreased visibility and hazardous conditions throughout the region, their voices taking on the weary tone of professionals accustomed to battling the elements, but respectful of nature's unpredictable mood. I adjusted my grip on the steering wheel and felt the familiar weight of responsibility that came with piloting 40 tons of machinery through conditions that would challenge even experienced operators. When I next glanced toward my passenger perhaps 15 minutes later, the seatbelt had definitely tightened further around her torso. The diagonal strap now pressed firmly against her dress, creating clearly visible indentations in the pale fabric, while the lap portion appeared to be pulling her deeper into the seat cushion with a persistence that defied normal mechanical behavior. Yet her expression remained serene, almost meditative, as if she were entirely unaware of the growing constriction around her body. Her breathing showed no signs of distress, maintaining the same steady rhythm that had characterized her presence since entering the cab. I felt a flutter of concern mixed with confusion, wondering if perhaps there was a malfunction in the seat's safety system that I had never encountered before. Modern passenger restraints were designed with various adjustment mechanisms and tension regulators, but I had never heard of one that continued to tighten automatically once fastened. The thought crossed my mind to suggest she release and refasten the belt, but something about her peaceful demeanor made me hesitate to interrupt what seemed to be a deliberate state of rest. The highway began a steep descent as we passed through a section known locally as Devil's Canyon, a stretch of road that demanded complete attention due to its numerous switchbacks and dramatic elevation changes. I downshifted to let the engine brake assist with our controlled descent, feeling the familiar vibration through the floorboards. As the mechanical systems worked in harmony, to manage our speed. The rain continued its relentless assault on the windshield, and I leaned forward slightly to maintain optimal visibility through the storm's increasingly violent display. It was during this period of intense concentration that I became gradually aware of a sound that didn't belong to the usual symphony of highway travel. Beneath the engine noise and weather percussion, I could detect a faint but persistent creaking, like leather being stretched beyond its intended limits, or fabric fibers beginning to separate under sustained pressure. The sound seemed to be coming from the passenger side of the cab, though its exact source remained unclear in the acoustic complexity of the truck's interior environment. When a brief clearing in the storm allowed me to safely divert attention from the road, I turned to check on my passenger and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air seeping through the cab's weather seals. The seatbelt had tightened considerably around her body, pressing deeply into the fabric of her dress, and creating visible ridges where the straps cut across her torso and lap. The belt now appeared to be actively constricting, like a slow-moving serpent, gradually increasing its grip on captured prey, yet her face showed no signs of discomfort or distress. Instead, she seemed to be experiencing something approaching bliss, her eyes closed and her lips curved in the faintest suggestion of a smile. Her chest rose and fell in the same measured rhythm as before, despite what should have been significant restriction of her breathing. When she sensed my attention upon her, she opened her eyes and turned to meet my gaze with an expression of profound serenity that sent ice water through my veins. "It's been so long since I felt this secure," she said, her voice carrying the same calm cadence as before, though now each word seemed to require slightly more effort to produce. "The belt understands what I need in ways that others never could." As she spoke, I could see the diagonal strap continuing its inexorable tightening, pressing so deeply into her dress that the pale fabric had begun to bunch and fold around the leather restraint. I reached across the space between us, intending to help her release the belt mechanism, but she caught my wrist with fingers that felt impossibly cold against my skin. Her grip possessed a strength that seemed entirely at odds with her slight frame, and her touch carried an electric quality that made the hair on my arms stand upright, despite the cab's warm interior. Her eyes, which I had initially thought merely reflective, now seemed to contain their own light source, glowing with an intensity that made it difficult to maintain direct eye contact. "Please don't interfere," she said, her voice taking on a melodic quality that seemed to resonate through the truck's metal frame. "This is how it's supposed to happen. The belt knows when someone truly needs to be held, really held, in a way that never lets go." The creaking sound had become more pronounced now, and I realized it wasn't coming from the seatbelt at all, but from her body itself, as if her bones and organs were adjusting to accommodate the increasing constriction. The highway had leveled out as we entered a valley region, but the storm seemed to be following our progress with supernatural persistence. Lightning began to accompany the rain. The eyes in transit. From Marcus Chen. "The thing about hauling livestock is that you get used to the sounds they make, the way they shift and shuffle in their metal containers. As your 18-wheeler rolls down endless stretches of highway. After 12 years behind the wheel, I'd learned to read those noises like sheet music, understanding when the cattle were restless from the road's vibration, or when the pigs were simply adjusting to a turn. But that November night, somewhere between Bakersfield and Phoenix, I started hearing something that didn't belong in my usual symphony of freight. The rain had been falling steadily since I'd left the depot, turning the desert highway into a ribbon of reflected headlights and neon smears. My Kenworth's wipers beat a hypnotic rhythm against the windshield as I navigated through the sparse traffic of the late evening hours. The CB radio crackled occasionally with tired voices of other drivers, but mostly it was just me, the hum of the engine, and the familiar rustle of my cargo settling in for the long haul to the processing plant in Arizona. I'd been driving for about 4 hours when I first noticed the scratching. It was subtle at first, almost like the sound of claws on metal, but I dismissed it as normal animal behavior. Cattle have hooves, sure, but sometimes they'd paw at the trailer floor when they were anxious. The sound came in irregular intervals, sometimes stopping for miles at a stretch, then resuming just as I'd begun to forget about it. But as the night wore on and the rain intensified, the scratching became more deliberate, more rhythmic, almost like Morse code tapped against the inner walls of my trailer. The first rest stop I encountered was a lonely truck plaza with flickering fluorescent lights that cast sickly pools of illumination across the wet asphalt. I pulled into a space away from the other rigs, killed the engine, and sat for a moment listening to the rain drum against the cab roof. The scratching had stopped the moment I'd begun to brake, which struck me as odd. Animals don't usually coordinate their behavior with driving patterns. But I shrugged it off and grabbed my flashlight from the glove compartment. The trailer's rear doors were secured with the standard Department of Agriculture seals, unbroken and properly documented. I walked along the side of the trailer, playing my flashlight beam through the ventilation slats, expecting to see the usual dark shapes of cattle pressed against each other in the confined space. Instead, what I saw made me stop dead in my tracks and question whether the long hours and monotonous road had finally gotten to me. Eyes. Dozens of them, but not the gentle bovine eyes I was expecting. These were different, more alert, more focused. They seemed to track the movement of my flashlight with an intelligence that made my skin crawl. I blinked hard and looked again, telling myself it was just the angle of the light playing tricks. But the eyes remained fixed on me with an intensity that felt almost predatory. I completed my inspection quickly and climbed back into the cab, but sleep wouldn't come. Every time I closed my eyes, I could feel those other eyes watching me through the metal walls that separated us. The scratching resumed around 2 in the morning, but now it seemed to come from multiple sources, as if my entire cargo had become restless simultaneously. I started the engine earlier than planned, and pulled back onto the highway, hoping that movement would settle whatever was going on in my trailer. The desert stretched endlessly on both sides of the interstate, broken only by the occasional cluster of lights marking a small town or gas station. My headlights carved a tunnel through the darkness ahead, while the red glow of my taillights painted the road behind me in hellish hues. The rain had tapered off to a light drizzle, but the humidity seemed to press against the windows like invisible hands. I cranked up the air conditioning and tried to focus on the road, but the scratching continued, now accompanied by what sounded almost like whispers. At first I convinced myself it was just the white noise of tires on wet pavement mixing with the trailer's ventilation system, but as I strained to listen, the sounds became more distinct. There was definitely something that resembled voices back there, low and murmuring, rising and falling in what might have been conversation. I turned down the radio and rolled down my window slightly, letting the cool desert air flow into the cab. The murmuring continued, just audible enough to be disturbing, but too indistinct to make out any words. I tried calling my dispatcher on the CB, but got only static in return. The digital clock on my dashboard read 3:37 when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Not much, just thin slivers of pale illumination that pulsed irregularly, like fireflies trapped in a jar. I knew for certain that there were no lights installed in that trailer, just basic ventilation and the standard tie-down points for securing livestock. The light seemed to move, flowing from one section to another, as if whatever was producing it was mobile. The Kenworth's air brakes hissed as I brought the rig to a stop, and immediately the sounds from the trailer ceased. The sudden silence was almost worse than the mysterious noises had been, creating an expectant hush that made every small sound seem amplified. Walking around to the back of the trailer again, I noticed that the seals were still intact, but something about them looked different. The plastic seemed slightly discolored, as if exposed to heat, and when I touched one with my finger, it felt warm despite the cool desert air. I pressed my ear against the rear door and listened intently, but heard nothing except my own pulse hammering in my temple. Then, without warning, something struck the inside of the door with tremendous force, causing the entire trailer to rock on its suspension. I stumbled backward, my flashlight beam dancing wildly across the ground, and heard what sounded unmistakably like laughter echoing from within the container. Not animal sounds, Not the mechanical noises of shifting cargo, but genuine human laughter with an edge of hysteria that made my scalp tighten with terror. I ran back to the cab and fired up the engine, desperate to reach my destination and unload whatever nightmare I was carrying. The highway stretched ahead like a black river, and I pushed the Kenworth harder than I should have, watching the speedometer climb past the legal limit as I tried to outrun the growing certainty that my cargo was not what it was supposed to be. The voices in the trailer grew louder and more distinct as dawn approached, no longer bothering to disguise themselves as animal sounds. I could make out fragments of conversation, discussions about landscapes they were seeing, comments about the weather, observations about other vehicles on the road. It was as if the contents of my trailer were somehow aware of everything happening outside, watching the world pass by through means I couldn't begin to understand. I backed up to the loading dock with hands that trembled slightly on the steering wheel, eager to complete this delivery and forget about the entire experience. The plant workers approached with their standard clipboards and hydraulic equipment, ready for what they assumed would be a routine unloading. But as they broke the seals and prepared to open the trailer doors, I found myself walking quickly toward my cab, not wanting to see what would be revealed. Behind me, I heard the metallic screech of the doors swinging open, followed by a moment of absolute silence that seemed to stretch for an eternity. Then one of the workers called out to me, confusion evident in his voice. I turned reluctantly and saw him standing at the open trailer, staring into empty space. The container was completely vacant, showing no signs that it had ever carried any cargo at all. No straw, no evidence of animals, no explanation for the sounds and lights that had plagued my journey through the night. I signed the delivery papers with a hand that I willed steady and climbed back into my cab, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had gotten out when those doors opened, something that had been watching and waiting for exactly this moment. As I drove away from the plant, I caught a glimpse of movement in my side mirror, just a quick flash of eyes reflecting the morning sunlight, following me down the road with patient, hungry intelligence. The curtain that breathes. From Marcus Boy. The thing about being a long-haul trucker for 23 years is that you develop routines. Little rituals that keep you sane when you're pushing through the endless miles of interstate that blur together like a fever dream. My ritual always started the same way when I'd pull into a rest stop for mandatory sleep, check the mirrors, set the air brakes, kill the engine, and then slide back that heavy curtain to my sleeper cab. The curtain was thick, industrial-grade fabric in a deep burgundy color that blocked out most of the light from the parking lot floods. It had served me well through thousands of nights in truck stops from Maine to California. That curtain had never once closed by itself until the night I pulled into the Whispering Pines Travel Plaza outside of Nowhere, Montana, where the autumn wind carried sounds that seemed almost like voices, and the darkness beyond the parking lot felt deeper than it should have been. I'd been driving my Kenworth W900L through a late October storm that had been chasing me across 3 states, the kind of weather that makes you white-knuckle the steering wheel and pray your tires find purchase on asphalt that's slicker than a politician's promise. The rain hammered against my windshield in sheets so thick that even my wipers on full speed couldn't keep up, and the wind rocked my 18-wheeler like it was nothing more than a child's toy. Lightning split the sky every few minutes, illuminating the desolate landscape in stark electric blue snapshots that burned into your retinas and left you seeing ghosts in the darkness that followed. When I finally spotted the neon sign for Whispering Pines cutting through the storm like a lighthouse beacon, I nearly wept with relief. The place looked like it had seen better decades, with half the neon letters flickering or burned out entirely, casting an unsteady glow across the wet pavement. But it had diesel pumps and a parking area for big rigs, and after 14 hours behind the wheel, that was all I needed. I maneuvered my rig into a spot at the far end of the lot, away from the handful of other trucks that were hunkered down like sleeping giants waiting for the storm to pass. The engine's rumble died away, leaving only the sound of rain drumming against the cab and the occasional groan of wind-stressed metal. I went through my usual routine, checking that everything was secure before making my way back to the sleeper compartment. The curtain slid across its track with the familiar whisper of fabric against metal, sealing me into my private sanctuary. I'd installed LED strip lights along the ceiling of the sleeper to give it a warmer feel than the harsh fluorescence that came standard, and in that soft glow, the space felt almost homey despite being barely larger than a coffin. I was settling onto my narrow bunk when I heard it for the first time, the soft rustle of the curtain moving. I glanced up, expecting to see it swaying slightly from the air conditioning or maybe a draft, but the curtain was hanging perfectly still. The sound came again, a gentle whisper of fabric, and this time I watched more carefully. The curtain remained motionless, but the sound was unmistakable, as if invisible hands were running along its surface. Probably just the storm playing tricks with the air pressure, I told myself, though I'd never experienced anything like it before. These old travel plazas could be drafty, and with a wind like tonight's, strange things were bound to happen. I pulled out my logbook and began updating my hours, trying to focus on the mundane task of recording miles and fuel stops. But the rustling came again, longer this time, like someone drawing the curtain slowly across its track, even though it remained exactly where I'd left it. The LED strips flickered once, casting brief shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources, and in that moment of dimness, I could have sworn I saw the curtain bulge inward slightly, as if something on the other side was pressing against it. But when the lights steadied, everything appeared normal again. Just the storm, I repeated to myself, though my hands had started to shake slightly as I wrote in the logbook. I tried to push the strange occurrences from my mind as I prepared for sleep, changing into my sleeping clothes and checking that my phone was charging. The rain continued its relentless percussion against the cab, and occasionally a particularly strong gust of wind would rock the truck just enough to remind me how small and vulnerable I was out here in the middle of nowhere. But I'd weathered countless storms over the years, and this one would pass like all the others. I was lying on my back, staring at the ceiling and listening to the storm, when I heard the unmistakable sound of the curtain sliding along its track, not the phantom rustling from before, but the actual mechanical whisper of metal rings moving across metal rock. I sat up quickly, my heart suddenly hammering against my ribs, and saw that the curtain had drawn itself shut completely, sealing off the sleeper from the main cab. Maybe the track was warped from age and changes in temperature, causing the curtain to slide on its own. Maybe the storm had created some kind of pressure differential that pulled it closed, but as I reached out to slide it back open, my fingers trembling slightly, I noticed that the curtain felt different somehow, heavier and colder than it should have been, like fabric that had been soaked in ice water and wrung out just enough to stop dripping. I pushed the curtain aside with more force than necessary, and it slid back along the track with obvious reluctance, as if it was fighting against my effort. The main cab beyond looked exactly as I'd left it, dashboard lights glowing softly in the darkness, the storm continuing its assault on the windshield. Nothing had changed, yet everything felt wrong in a way I couldn't articulate. Settling back onto the bunk, I tried to convince myself that fatigue and the storm were conspiring to make me paranoid. 23 years on the road had taught me that isolation and exhaustion could play the cruelest tricks on a driver's mind, turning shadows into monsters and ordinary sounds into harbingers of doom. But I'd also learned to trust my instincts, and right now every instinct I possessed was screaming that something was very wrong with this place. The curtain closed again 10 minutes later. This time I was dozing, hovering in that twilight space between waking and sleeping, when the sound jolted me back to full consciousness. The curtain had drawn itself shut once more, but this time I could hear something else, a soft breathing sound, rhythmic and deliberate, coming from the fabric itself, not from behind it or in front of it, but from within the material, as if the curtain had developed lungs and was drawing slow, measured breaths. I lay perfectly still, afraid to move, afraid to breathe, as the sound continued, in and out, with the steady rhythm of someone in deep sleep. The LED strips flickered again, and in their unsteady light, I could see the curtain moving almost imperceptibly, expanding and contracting with each breath, like the chest of some massive sleeping creature. My hand crept toward my phone, thinking I should call someone. Anyone, but who would believe a story about a breathing curtain in a truck stop in the middle of Montana? And more importantly, what exactly would I be calling for help about? The curtain wasn't threatening me, wasn't doing anything overtly harmful. It was just existing in a way that curtains weren't supposed to exist, and that was hardly grounds for an emergency response. The breathing grew deeper, more pronounced, and I realized I could feel warm air moving across my skin with each exhale. The temperature in the sleeper began to rise, becoming uncomfortably close and humid, like being inside someone's mouth. The curtain surface began to glisten with what looked like condensation, but when a drop fell onto my arm, it felt thick and viscous, nothing like water. That's when I noticed the curtain was no longer hanging straight. It had begun to bow inward, curving toward me like a sail filled with wind, except there was no wind in the enclosed sleeper. The burgundy fabric stretched and bulged, taking on an organic quality that made my stomach churn with revulsion. Whatever was happening, I knew I needed to get out of the sleeper immediately. I swung my legs over the side of the bunk and stood up, intending to push past the curtain into the main cab. But as I approached, it suddenly billowed toward me with frightening speed. The fabric wrapped around me like grasping arms, warm and damp and sickeningly alive. I could feel it trying to pull me backward, away from the cab, deeper into the sleeper, and panic flooded through me like ice water. Fighting against the fabric with every ounce of strength I possessed, I managed to tear free and stumble forward into the main cab, gasping and shaking. The last words of Highway 49, from Marcus Reed. D. CB radio had been crackling with static for the better part of 3 hours as I guided my Peterbilt through the winding darkness of Highway 4. Rain drummed steadily against the windshield, each droplet catching the amber glow of my running lights before sliding away into the night. The rhythmic sweep of the wipers and the low rumble of the diesel engine beneath me created a hypnotic symphony that made the long haul from Sacramento to Reno feel almost meditative. Almost. I'd been running this route for 15 years, knew every curve and grade like the back of my weathered hands. The radio chatter usually kept me company during these midnight runs. Truckers sharing road conditions, weather updates, and the occasional tall tale to pass the time. But tonight, Channel 19 had fallen unusually quiet, save for the persistent hiss of interference that seemed to ebb and flow like electronic breathing. The dashboard clock glowed 2:47 a.m. when the first transmission came through, cutting through the static with startling clarity. The voice was that of an older man, gravelly and worn, speaking in measured, deliberate tones that immediately caught my attention. "Tell Martha I love her," the voice said, each word floating through the speaker with an odd, distant quality. "Tell her the roses need watering, and the insurance papers are in the desk drawer." I reached for the handset, thumb hovering over the transmit button. The transmission had that quality of a trucker in distress, maybe someone whose rig had broken down or worse. But before I could respond, the voice continued, and something in those next words made my skin prickle with unease. "I can see the headlights coming fast. Too fast. I don't think they're going to stop." The radio fell silent again, leaving only the whisper of static and the steady drumming of rain. I keyed the mic, my voice echoing slightly in the cab. "Breaker 19. This is Midnight Runner. Driver, what's your 20? Do you need assistance?" The only response was the gentle hiss of empty airwaves, and after a moment I set the handset back in its cradle, though something about that transmission left me feeling unsettled. 20 minutes passed before the next voice emerged from the static, this one belonging to a woman, younger with a slight southern accent that carried a note of desperate urgency. "Bobby, if you're listening, I need you to know it wasn't your fault," she said, her words floating through the darkness of my cab like whispers from another world. "The brake line, it just gave out on Dead Man's Curve. There was nothing you could have done different." The hair on the back of my neck began to rise as I listened, my knuckles whitening as I gripped the steering wheel tighter. This wasn't normal CB chatter. These transmissions had the quality of final messages, last words spoken into the void. I tried again to raise the woman, but my call went unanswered, swallowed by the electronic silence that seemed to press against the windows of my truck like something alive. The rain intensified as I descended toward the valley, my headlights cutting through curtains of water that made the world beyond my windshield feel insubstantial, dreamlike. It was then that the third transmission crackled through, a teenager's voice, shaking with fear and barely controlled panic. "Mom, Dad, I'm sorry I took the car without asking. I just wanted to see Jenny before she moved away. The road is so slippery, and I can't see where I'm going. I think I'm lost." This time, I didn't hesitate. I grabbed the handset and keyed the mic immediately. "Son, this is Midnight Runner. What's your location? I can guide you to safety." But my transmission seemed to vanish into the ether, as if the radio was only capable of receiving these strange, one-way messages. The boy's voice continued, growing fainter, more distant. Tell her I really did love her. Tell her I would have waited for her to come back." My mouth went dry as the implications began to sink in. These weren't distress calls from stranded drivers. They had the unmistakable quality of final words, messages delivered in those crucial moments when people realize their time is running out. But how was I hearing them? And why were they coming through on Channel 19? The trucker's channel that had been my companion for countless miles over the years. It was my own voice, older and more strained than I'd ever heard it, speaking words I had never said. "This is Marcus Reed, driving eastbound on Highway 49. If anyone can hear this, tell my daughter Sarah that I'm proud of her, that I always was, even when I was too stubborn to say it." I stared at the radio in horror, my foot unconsciously easing off the accelerator. The voice that was unmistakably mine continued with devastating clarity. "Tell her the money I saved is in the coffee can behind the workshop. She'll know which one. And tell her that her mother was right about me needing to slow down, to spend more time at home." I should have listened. My hands trembled as I reached for the handset again, desperate to break through whatever barrier was preventing my transmissions from going out. But even as I keyed the mic, my own voice continued its ghostly monologue from the radio's speaker. "The fog came out of nowhere. Can't see more than a few feet ahead. I think I missed the curve by the old mill. The truck's rolling, and I can't." The fog my radio voice had mentioned was already beginning to form in the valley ahead, wispy tendrils rising from the warm asphalt to meet the cool rain. And somewhere in the distance, barely visible through the gathering mist, I could make out the dark silhouette of the old grain mill that had been abandoned for decades. The realization hit me like a physical blow. The CB was somehow receiving last words, final transmissions from drivers who had met their end along this stretch of highway. And now it was broadcasting my own future death, describing an accident that hadn't happened yet but apparently would, somewhere in the fog-shrouded darkness ahead. I downshifted, feeling the engine brake engage as I fought to reduce speed. The fog was thickening rapidly now, transforming my headlight beams into weak, diffused glows that barely penetrated the growing wall of mist. The curve by the old mill was less than a mile ahead, and despite my attempts to rationalize what I'd heard, I couldn't shake the bone-deep certainty that the radio had been showing me my own future. But even as I considered it, I realized my CB was still disconnected, its cord dangling uselessly beside my seat. And somehow I doubted that anyone would be able to hear me anyway. The radio seemed to exist in its own pocket of reality, receiving messages from moments of final desperation, but unable to send them back into the normal world. More voices now, a chorus of final words from travelers who had met their end along Highway 4, an elderly couple speaking in unison about their children and grandchildren, a young mother asking someone to take care of her baby, a trucker like myself, describing mechanical failure in a tunnel I knew was still 5 miles ahead. But it was my own voice that dominated the airwaves now, that older, more frightened version of myself, still describing the accident that awaited me in the fog. "Sarah, honey, Daddy's truck is going over. I want you to know that every mile I drove was for you, to give you a better life than I had. Don't be sad for too long. Live the life your old man never got to. The fog enveloped my truck completely now, reducing visibility to almost nothing. I crept forward at barely 20 miles per hour, my hands white-knuckled on the steering wheel, as I strained to see the road ahead. The curve was coming, had to be just around the next bend, and every instinct screamed at me to stop, to refuse to play out the scene the radio had already described. But stopping in the middle of the highway in zero visibility seemed just as dangerous as continuing forward. I activated my hazard lights and maintained my crawling pace, hoping against hope that I could navigate the curve safely and prove the radio's grim prophecy wrong. The engine's rumble seemed muffled in the fog, as if the mist was absorbing sound as well as light, creating a cocoon of isolation around my truck. The overpass of the forgotten. From Marcus Satie. The CB radio crackled to life as I guided my 18-wheeler through the desert darkness of Nevada, the monotonous hum of diesel and tires against asphalt, creating a hypnotic rhythm that had carried me through countless nights like this one. Static filled the cabin before a weathered voice broke through, belonging to Jake, a driver I'd been chatting with for the past 100 miles. "Hey there, partner." Jake's voice carried that familiar road-weary tone we all developed after years behind the wheel. "You coming up on that overpass about 15 miles ahead? The one with all them missing person flyers?" I adjusted my grip on the steering wheel, glancing at the GPS display that showed nothing but empty highway stretching endlessly into the black Nevada night. The headlights of my Peterbilt cut through the darkness, revealing only sagebrush and endless desert on either side of the interstate. "Can't say I've noticed any flyers out here, Jake. The stretch is pretty desolate." "Oh, you'll see it," Jake replied with a chuckle that didn't quite mask something else in his voice, something that made me unconsciously ease off the accelerator just a fraction. "Been driving this route for 15 years and that overpass always gives me the creeps. Local folks call it the overpass of the forgotten. Probably just trucker legend, but I always feel better once I'm past it." The miles rolled by in their steady progression as Jake's voice faded in and out with the CB's reach, our conversation turning to mundane matters of freight schedules and truck stop coffee quality. But his words about the overpass lingered in my mind, like a persistent it. I'd been driving cross-country routes for 8 years, and every stretch of highway had its stories, its legends whispered between drivers during long, lonely nights. Most were harmless folklore, born from isolation and the play of headlights on unfamiliar terrain. The desert around me seemed to grow quieter as I approached the 15-mile mark Jake had mentioned. Even the usual crackle of distant CB chatter had faded to an unusual stillness. My truck's engine maintained its steady rumble, but somehow the sound felt muffled, as if the very air had grown thicker. The temperature gauge read normal, the oil pressure steady, yet something indefinable had changed in the atmosphere of the cab. Then I saw it rising from the darkness ahead, a concrete structure spanning the highway like a gateway between nowhere and nothing. The overpass appeared older than the relatively modern interstate it crossed, its concrete stained with decades of desert weather and adorned with what looked like layers upon layers of paper fragments fluttering in the slight breeze. As my headlights swept across the structure, I could make out that these weren't just random litter but dozens, perhaps hundreds of photographs and papers covering every available surface of the overpass support. I downshifted as I approached, my truck's air brakes releasing a soft hiss that seemed unnaturally loud in the desert silence. The overpass loomed larger now, and my headlights illuminated the strange collection more clearly. They were missing person flyers, just as Jake had said, but far more than I'd initially realized. They covered the concrete supports like some macabre wallpaper, overlapping and layered so thickly that the original gray concrete was barely visible beneath. The faces staring back at me from those faded photographs seemed to follow my truck as I passed beneath the structure. Men, women, children, elderly folks, all frozen in time within those desperate pleas for information. "Have you seen this person? Last seen? Reward for any information." The standard phrases of loss and hope repeated endlessly across the concrete canvas. What struck me most was how old, Some of the flyers appeared to be. The ones on the outer layer were recent enough, printed on bright white paper with clear digital photographs, but beneath them I could glimpse older ones, their edges yellowed and curled, the photographs grainy and obviously taken with film cameras from decades past. Some appeared so weathered by sun and wind that only fragments remained, ghostly impressions of faces long since faded to illegibility. As I emerged from beneath the overpass, I found myself checking the mirrors compulsively, unable to shake the sensation that something was following my trailer. The desert behind me appeared empty, illuminated only by my taillights painting the sagebrush in soft red hues. Yet the feeling persisted. I reached for the CB radio, suddenly eager for Jake's familiar voice, but found only static across all channels. The next truck stop wasn't scheduled for another 60 miles, but I found myself considering an unplanned break, anything to shake off the peculiar unease that had settled over me like a suffocating blanket. Instead, I maintained speed and tried to focus on the rhythm of the road, the familiar comfort of oil pressure and engine temperature gauges, the soft glow of dashboard lights that had been my companions through thousands of miles of night driving. It was 20 minutes later when I noticed the figure walking along the shoulder ahead. At first I attributed it to the usual tricks of night vision and highway hypnosis, a piece of debris perhaps, or a reflector post catching the light in an unusual way. But as my truck drew closer, the shape resolved itself into unmistakably human form. Someone walking slowly along the gravel shoulder with their back to the approaching traffic. In 8 years of night driving, I'd encountered very few pedestrians on remote stretches of interstate, and never this far from any town or settlement. The nearest exit was 30 miles behind me, and according to my atlas, nothing but empty desert stretched ahead for another 40 miles. I began to slow the truck, my hand moving toward the CB radio to report the situation to highway patrol. Someone walking alone on a desert highway at 2 in the morning was likely in serious trouble, possibly a breakdown situation or as a driver I'd developed an instinctive response to help fellow travelers in distress, and this person clearly qualified. But as my headlights finally reached the walking figure, something made me hesitate before keying the microphone. The person appeared to be a middle-aged man wearing a plaid shirt and jeans. Ordinary enough, but something about his posture seemed wrong. He walked with a peculiar stillness, his arms hanging motionless at his sides, his head never turning despite the approach of my truck's powerful headlights and the growing rumble of the diesel engine. I pulled into the left lane to give him plenty of clearance and slowed to match his walking pace as I drew alongside. Through the passenger window I could see his profile clearly now, and what I saw made my hands tighten involuntarily on the steering wheel. His face had the waxy, artificial quality of an old photograph, as if someone had taken a portrait and somehow projected it onto a three-dimensional form. More disturbing still was the recognition that slowly dawned as I stared at his features. I had seen this face before, just minutes earlier, staring back at me from one of the missing person flyers beneath the overpass. The same plaid shirt, the same general appearance, though the photograph had been grainy and weather-faded. I accelerated past him, telling myself that the resemblance was coincidental, that the strangeness of the overpass had simply put suggestible thoughts in my mind. Night driving played tricks on perception, especially after long hours behind the wheel. I'd experienced highway hypnosis before, those moments when familiar objects transformed into something unsettling under the influence of fatigue and isolation. This one was a woman in a blue dress, walking with the same unnatural stillness as the first figure, her arms motionless, her head never turning toward the approaching truck. And like the man before her, her face carried that same photographic quality, that unsettling two-dimensional appearance projected onto human form. When I passed close enough to see her clearly, my blood ran cold with recognition. A younger woman in a blue dress, smiling hopefully in a photograph that had been faded by years of desert sun and wind. Jake's voice came through clearly, though something in his tone had changed, becoming more urgent and strained than before. "Marcus, you copy? You still out there, partner?" I grabbed the microphone with a hand that wasn't entirely steady. "Jake, yeah, I'm here. Listen, I'm seeing some strange things out here. People walking along the highway near that overpass you mentioned. Static filled the channel for several seconds before Jake's response came through, and when it did, his voice carried a note of genuine concern. Marcus, I need you to listen to me very carefully. Don't stop for anyone out there. Don't even slow down. Just keep driving and don't look back. What are you talking about, Jake? These people might need help. Those aren't people, partner. I don't know what they are, but they're not people. The weight of watching. From Marcus. So, the fog rolled in like a living thing, that October night, thick and deliberate, pressing itself against my windshield with an almost deliberate persistence that made my skin crawl. I've been driving these mountain routes for 15 years, hauling lumber from the Pacific Northwest mills to distribution centers across 3 states, and I thought I'd seen every kind of weather Mother Nature could throw at a trucker. But this fog was different. It didn't just obscure the road ahead, it seemed to pulse and breathe against the glass, leaving strange patterns in the condensation that looked almost like handprints or faces or something I couldn't quite name, but definitely didn't want to think about too hard. My Peterbilt's diesel engine hummed its familiar rhythm as I downshifted on the winding mountain road. The sound usually a comfort after all these years behind the wheel. Tonight, though, even that steady mechanical heartbeat couldn't shake the unease that had settled in my chest like a cold stone. The fog had been building for the past hour, starting as wisps around the tree line and gradually thickening until it surrounded my rig completely. My headlights barely penetrated 10 feet ahead, creating a small bubble of yellowish light that moved with me through what felt like a gray, impenetrable void. The radio had been crackling with static for miles, occasionally picking up fragments of distant conversations that didn't quite make sense. Weather reports cut in and out, mentioning unusual atmospheric conditions and advising caution for high-profile vehicles on mountain passes. I kept one hand on the steering wheel and reached for my CB radio, hoping to hear from other drivers who might be dealing with the same conditions, but all I got was that low, persistent static that seemed to have its own rhythm, almost like breathing. What bothered me most was how the fog seemed to press against my truck with physical weight. I could feel it in the way my rig handled, as if invisible hands were pushing against the sides of my trailer, creating a resistance that shouldn't have been there. The wipers swept across the windshield in their steady cadence, but instead of clearing the glass, they seemed to smear the moisture into those strange, almost deliberate patterns. Each pass of the blades revealed new shapes in the condensation, swirls and curves that looked disturbingly organic, like the whirls of fingerprints magnified 100 times. I'd been making good time before the fog hit, planning to reach the truck stop at Clearwater Summit well before midnight. Now I was crawling along at 20 miles per hour, following the faint yellow line that occasionally appeared in my headlight beam, like a ghostly guide through this gray night. The familiar landmarks I'd used for years to navigate this route had vanished completely, swallowed by walls of mist so dense they seemed solid. Even my GPS seemed confused, the little arrow on the screen wavering uncertainly, as if the satellites themselves couldn't penetrate whatever was surrounding me. The first real sign that something was wrong came when I noticed my fuel gauge. I'd filled up at the base of the mountain just 2 hours ago, but the needle was sitting well below half. That was impossible. My Peterbilt got consistent mileage, and I tracked every gallon religiously for my logbooks. I tapped the gauge with my finger, hoping it was just a malfunction, but the needle didn't budge. Either I had a serious fuel leak, which I would have smelled by now, or something was very wrong with my understanding of time and distance. That's when I started paying closer attention to the fog itself, and what I saw made my hands tighten on the steering wheel until my knuckles went white. The mist wasn't moving randomly the way fog should. Instead, it seemed to flow in deliberate patterns, swirling around my truck in spirals that followed my movement with an intelligence that made my stomach turn. When I slowed down, the fog grew thicker, pressing harder against the window. When I tried to speed up, it seemed to resist, creating a pressure that my engine had to fight against, like swimming through honey. What had started as vague, organic shapes were now clearly handprints. Dozens of them, overlapping and pressing against the glass from the outside. But that was impossible. I was sitting high up in my cab, at least 8 feet off the ground. Nothing human could reach my windshield, especially not while I was moving. Yet there they were, clear as day in the moisture, palm prints and finger marks, some large, some small, some that looked disturbingly like children's hands. I tried the CB radio again, desperate to hear another human voice. But the static had taken on a new quality. Beneath the electronic crackle, I could swear I heard voices, whispers. Really too faint to understand, but definitely there. Sometimes they seemed to be coming from right beside me, as if someone were sitting in my passenger seat and murmuring just below the threshold of hearing. I turned up the volume, straining to make out words, but that only made the whispers fade further into the background noise. Mile marker 47 appeared briefly in my headlight beam, before disappearing back into the gray walls surrounding me. I knew this road well enough to know that mile marker 47 was halfway up the mountain, which meant I should be able to see the lights of Clearwater Summit truck stop from here on clear night. Tonight I saw nothing but fog pressing so thick against my windows that I was starting to feel claustrophobic in my own cab. The handprints on the windshield were multiplying, and now they were appearing on my side windows too, as if invisible people were walking alongside my truck, keeping pace effortlessly, reaching out to touch the glass as I passed. The temperature gauge on my dashboard was climbing into the red, which didn't make sense. The October mountain air should have been keeping my engine cool, even on the grades. But something was making my radiator work overtime, as if the fog itself was generating heat. I could feel it through the windows now, a warmth that seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat, pressing against the glass with increasing intensity. That's when I saw the light ahead, faint but definitely there, glowing through the fog like a beacon. Relief flooded through me. It had to be the truck stop, or at least some kind of civilization. I pressed the accelerator, eager to reach whatever sanctuary that light promised, but as I drew closer, the glow didn't resolve into the familiar neon signs and bright parking lot illumination I expected. Instead, it seemed to be coming from within the fog itself, a phosphorescent blue-green radiance that pulsed in rhythm with the whispers on my radio. The light grew brighter as I approached, and the fog began to thin just enough for me to make out shapes moving within it. At first, I thought they were trees, or maybe other vehicles, but as my eyes adjusted, I realized they were figures, tall, impossibly thin silhouettes that stood motionless beside the road, their forms wavering like heat mirages. They seemed to be watching my truck pass, their heads turning to follow my movement with a fluid grace that made my blood run cold. The fuel gauge was now registering almost empty, which was absolutely impossible. I'd barely covered 30 miles since my last fill-up, but my truck was acting like it had been running on fumes for hours. The temperature gauge maxed out in the red zone, and warning lights began flickering across my dashboard like a Christmas display from hell. The figures in the fog were multiplying now, dozens of them lining both sides of the road, their elongated forms perfectly still except for those slowly turning heads. The blue-green light seemed to emanate from their general vicinity, casting an otherworldly glow that made the fog itself look alive. The handprints on my windows were so numerous now that they overlapped into a solid film of condensation, and I could hear sounds outside my cab, not quite footsteps, but something like fabric brushing against metal, or fingernails tapping against glass. I fumbled for my cell phone, knowing I probably wouldn't have signal but desperate to try anyway. The screen lit up showing full bars, which surprised me. But when I tried to dial 911, the numbers on the display began changing on their own, rearranging themselves into patterns that hurt to look at. The phone grew hot in my hand, so hot I had to drop it onto the passenger seat, where it continued to glow with that same blue-green light I was seeing in the fog. The steady rumble that had been my constant companion for hundreds of thousands of miles just stopped, leaving me coasting silently through the glowing fog with only the whisper of tires on asphalt and those increasingly urgent sounds from outside. I tried the ignition, pumping the accelerator, but nothing happened. My truck was now just a 40-ton paperweight rolling down a mountain road, surrounded by impossible figures and pressed on all sides by fog that had taken on the consistency of warm honey. The Ash Route. From Marcus Chen. The GPS coordinates led me deeper into Pennsylvania coal country than I'd ever driven before, past towns that looked like they'd been abandoned since the mines closed decades ago. My Peterbilt's headlights carved through the October fog as I navigated narrow roads that seemed to twist back on themselves, carrying a load of antique furniture bound for what my dispatcher had called a private estate sale. The delivery address was simply listed as Centralia Historic Preservation Society, though I'd never heard of any historic preservation happening in a place that had been burning underground for over 60 years. The engine hummed its familiar diesel lullaby as I checked my watch. Nearly midnight, which meant I was running about 4 hours behind schedule, thanks to a wrong turn somewhere near Mount Carmel. The client had been very specific about the delivery window, insisting the furniture arrive between midnight and dawn due to atmospheric conditions being optimal for preservation. Strange requirements, but in 23 years of long-haul trucking, I'd learned not to question the peculiarities of customers willing to pay premium rates for unusual delivery schedules. Street signs appeared sporadically in my headlight beams, some melted into illegible metal sculptures, others simply gone, leaving behind post stumps that jutted from cracked asphalt like broken teeth. The few remaining buildings I passed stood like hollow sentinels, their windows dark and their rooflines sagging under the weight of abandonment. Yet beneath it all, I could see thin wisps of steam rising from manholes and sidewalk cracks, reminders that somewhere far below, the coal seam fire continued its decades-long burn. My CB radio crackled with static, occasionally catching fragments of distant conversations that faded in and out like ghosts trying to speak. The fog grew thicker as I followed the GPS's guidance, and I noticed my truck's thermometer reading climbing despite the late October chill. The heat seemed to be rising from the road itself, creating an otherworldly atmosphere where reality became negotiable and the familiar laws of temperature and weather bent into something altogether more mysterious. The delivery address finally appeared on my GPS as I turned onto what had once been a residential street. House foundations remained like archaeological sites, their concrete outlines filled with weeds and occasional pieces of debris that might have once been someone's treasured possession. But at the end of the street stood a Victorian mansion that seemed impossibly intact, its ornate gingerbread trim and wraparound porch looking as pristine as if it had been built yesterday rather than surviving decades in a town consumed by underground fire. I pulled my rig to a stop in front of the mansion, engaging the air brakes with their characteristic hiss, and immediately noticed how the fog seemed to part around the building like water around a stone. The mansion's windows glowed with warm, inviting light, and I could see elegant shadows moving behind lace curtains, suggesting people preparing for my arrival. A hand-painted sign near the front gate read Centralia Historic Preservation Society, keeping yesterday alive today, though the lettering seemed to shimmer slightly in the heat haze rising from the ground. As I climbed down from the cab, the first thing that struck me was the silence. No insects chirped, no night birds called, no distant highway noise carried on the wind. Even my footsteps seemed muffled as I walked around to the trailer doors, as if the very air had grown thick enough to absorb sound. The smell in the air was complex and unsettling, part sulfur from the underground fire, part old wood and fabric, and underneath it all, something that reminded me of my grandmother's attic, full of forgotten memories and time-weathered dreams. The mansion's front door opened before I could knock, and a woman emerged, who appeared to be in her 70s, dressed in an elegant burgundy dress that might have been fashionable in the night. Her silver hair was perfectly styled, and her smile was warm and welcoming as she approached with small, measured steps that somehow made no sound on the gravel walkway. "Marcus," she said, and her voice carried the faint accent of old Pennsylvania Dutch communities. We've been waiting for you. I'm Eleanor Hartwell, president of the Preservation Society. We're so grateful you were willing to make this rather unusual delivery. She gestured toward the trailer with hands that seemed almost translucent in the strange light. These pieces belong to families who lived here before the troubles began. We've been working so hard to bring their belongings home, where they belong. As I opened the trailer doors, I was struck by how the antique furniture seemed to glow in the mansion's light. Each piece was exquisite, a mahogany dining set that must have been worth thousands. Bedroom furniture with inlays that spoke of true craftsmanship. Mirrors with frames so ornate they looked like works of art in themselves. Eleanor directed me toward various rooms in the mansion, and as I carried each piece inside, I was amazed by the building's immaculate condition. The hardwood floors gleamed with fresh polish, the wallpaper looked newly hung, and every detail from the crown molding to the brass fixtures spoke of meticulous care. The underground fire, Eleanor explained, as I maneuvered a particularly heavy wardrobe through the front hallway, has actually helped us in our preservation efforts. The consistent heat and the unique atmospheric conditions created by the geological situation have proven ideal for maintaining period furnishings. We've developed techniques that allow us to keep these pieces in perfect condition, just as their original owners would have wanted. Other society members appeared to help with the delivery, each dressed in clothing that seemed to come from different decades, but all carrying themselves with the same quiet dignity as Eleanor. There was Thomas, a man in his 80s, wearing a perfectly pressed suit from what looked like the 1940s, and Margaret, perhaps 60, in a floral dress that reminded me of June Cleaver. They moved with practiced efficiency, directing each piece to its designated location, with the familiarity of people who had done this many times before. As the night progressed and my trailer grew emptier, I began to notice subtle details that made me increasingly uncomfortable. None of the society members cast reflections in the ornate mirrors I was delivering, though I could see my own image clearly as I maneuvered furniture past them. The floorboards never creaked under their feet, despite the mansion being well over a century old. And though they spoke to me frequently, offering thanks and gentle directions, I never saw them speak to each other, communicating instead through glances and gestures that seemed to carry entire conversation. The final piece was an enormous china cabinet that required all of us working together to move it into the mansion's dining room. As we positioned it against the far wall, I noticed that the wallpaper behind it looked different from the rest of the room, fresher, brighter, as if it had been protected from decades of light and aging. But as soon as the cabinet was in place, the wallpaper seemed to age before my eyes, taking on the same warm patina as the surrounding walls, as if the very act of placing the furniture had somehow completed a picture that had been waiting years to be finished. Eleanor walked me back to my truck as the fog began to thin with the approaching dawn, pressing a thick envelope into my hands. "Your payment, plus a bonus for the excellent service," she said, her voice carrying a note of what sounded like farewell rather than simple gratitude. "The society wants you to know how much this delivery has meant to us. These pieces have been away from home for so long, and now they can finally rest where they belong." As I climbed back into my cab and started the engine, I looked back at the mansion one last time. In the growing light of dawn, something seemed different about the building, though I couldn't quite put my finger on what had changed. The society members stood on the front porch, waving goodbye with the same warm smiles they'd worn throughout the night, and I found myself waving back despite a growing sense of unease that I couldn't explain. The drive back through Centralia in daylight revealed the true extent of the town's ghostly nature. In the harsh morning sun, I could see that most of the area was nothing but empty lots and cracked pavement, with warning signs posted by government agencies about dangerous ground conditions and toxic gases. The few structures that remained were obviously abandoned, their roofs collapsed and their walls crumbling from decades of neglect and the relentless heat from below. When I reached the spot where the mansion had stood, I pulled over and climbed out of my truck, certain I must have gotten confused about the location. But the address painted on my trailer matched the coordinates exactly, and I could see the tire tracks from my rig clearly visible in the cracked asphalt. Where the pristine Victorian mansion had stood just hours before, there was nothing but an empty foundation filled with ash and debris, surrounded by ground that was still warm to the touch and marked with the same government warning signs I'd seen throughout the abandoned town. I opened the envelope Eleanor had given me, finding not just the agreed-upon payment, but an additional amount that was more generous than any bonus I'd ever received. The Singing Steel. From Marcus Chengen. The brake lines started moaning somewhere between Tucson and Phoenix. A low, mournful sound that seemed to rise from the very soul of my Peterbilt. At first I thought it was just the desert wind playing tricks on the metal, whistling through gaps in the undercarriage as I rolled down Interstate 10 in the pre-dawn darkness. The sound was barely audible over the steady rumble of the Caterpillar engine, a ghostly harmony that made me lean forward in my seat, straining to hear if it was real or just another phantom born from too many miles and too little sleep. I'd been driving this route for 12 years, hauling electronics from the distribution center in El Paso to retailers scattered across the Southwest. This particular run was supposed to be routine, a straightforward overnight push through the Sonoran Desert with a trailer full of flat-screen televisions and gaming consoles bound for a Best Buy in Tempe. The October air was crisp enough to keep the windows cracked, letting in the sage-scented breeze that carried hints of distant rain. My CB radio crackled occasionally with the voices of other night haulers, their conversations a comforting reminder that I wasn't entirely alone out here in the vast emptiness. It rose and fell with the rhythm of my breathing, mimicking the natural flow of a lament or a prayer. I pressed the brake pedal experimentally, feeling the familiar resistance and hearing the usual hiss of the air brakes. But underneath it all was that strange musical wail. The sound didn't seem to correspond to my braking at all, continuing its eerie song whether I was accelerating, coasting, or slowing down. I pulled into a truck stop just past the Picacho Peak exit, parking under a flickering sodium light that cast everything in sickly yellow tone. The fuel islands were mostly empty at this hour, just a couple of other rigs taking on diesel and their drivers grabbing coffee and energy drinks for the long hauls ahead. I performed my standard inspection, walking around the truck with a flashlight, checking the tires, the trailer connections, and finally crouching down to examine the brake lines that staked along the chassis like metallic arteries. The lines were properly secured, no obvious signs of wear or damage, no leaks or loose fittings. I ran my fingers along the steel tubing, feeling for vibrations or unusual heat, but the metal was cool to the touch and seemed solid enough. Yet as I knelt there in the gravel, listening intently, I could still hear it, that soft, persistent moaning that seemed to emanate from deep within the brake system itself. The sound was clearer now, almost melodic, like someone humming a half-remembered lullaby in a language I couldn't quite identify. Back in the cab, I tried to dismiss it as a minor mechanical quirk, the kind of thing that develops in older trucks as parts wear and settle into new configuration. My Peterbilt had over 800,000 miles on the odometer, and she'd earned the right to develop a few idiosyncrasies. I'd driven trucks that whistled, rattled, and creaked in ways that would terrify a rookie driver but were perfectly normal once you got used to their particular personalities. This moaning brake line would just be another characteristic to add to her growing list of quirks. I decided to take the next exit, planning to pull into another truck stop and confront whatever was following me, but as I approached the off-ramp, something extraordinary happened. The moaning suddenly intensified, becoming so loud that it drowned out the engine noise and filled every corner of the cab with its anguished cry. At the same moment, the brake pedal went completely to the floor with no resistance whatsoever, as if the brake lines had suddenly been severed or emptied of fluid. My heart hammered against my ribs as I pumped the pedal desperately, feeling nothing but a dead, spongy response that meant complete brake failure. The exit ramp curved sharply to the right, and without brakes, I would never make the turn at my current speed. I downshifted frantically, using the engine to slow the massive truck, while simultaneously reaching for the parking brake handle. The trailer began to fishtail slightly as I fought to control the rig, the weight of all those televisions and electronics threatening to jackknife us both into the guardrail or off the roadway entirely. The brake pedal regained its firmness. The moaning dropped to barely audible levels, and I was able to slow the truck safely and take the exit as planned. My hands were shaking as I guided the Peterbilt into the truck stop parking lot, my heart still racing from the near disaster. I checked my mirrors immediately, looking for the pale truck that had been following me, but the highway behind us was empty, just dark asphalt stretching back toward the desert with no sign of any other vehicles. I spent the next hour going over every inch of the brake system with a mechanic's inspection light borrowed from another driver. But everything appeared to be in perfect working order. The brake fluid was at proper levels, the lines were secure and undamaged, and the system held pressure perfectly when tested. The mechanic, a grizzled veteran named Pete, who'd been working on trucks longer than I'd been alive, couldn't find anything wrong either. He listened to my description of the moaning sound with the patient expression of someone who'd heard every possible mechanical complaint over the years, but when he test drove the truck around the parking lot, the brake line remained silent. I completed my run to Tempe without further incident, the moaning having ceased. The route through the void. From Marcus Chen, the interstate system became my second home. Every exit ramp and truck stop as familiar as the lines on my weathered hands gripping the steering wheel of my Peterbilt. But sometimes, when the night grows thick and the fog rolls in like a living thing, the road shows you something new. Something that maybe was always there, waiting in the spaces between the miles we think we know. I was hauling a load of electronics from Portland to Minneapolis, running ahead of schedule thanks to light traffic and clear weather. The autumn air was crisp enough to keep me alert, and the steady hum of my engine had fallen into that perfect rhythm that makes the miles disappear. My CB radio crackled occasionally with the distant chatter of other night drivers, their voices a comforting reminder that I wasn't alone out there in the darkness. The route I was running should have kept me on Interstate 84 through the Columbia River Gorge. But as I crested a hill I'd driven hundreds of times before, something felt different. The familiar landmarks seemed shifted, like furniture moved just slightly in a room you know by heart. The GPS screen flickered, its blue glow washing over my face in irregular pulses, and when it steadied, the display showed something impossible. According to the satellite readout, I wasn't on any road at all. The screen showed my truck's icon floating in a vast expanse of digital gray, with no highways, no cities, no geographical features of any kind. I tapped the screen with my finger, thinking maybe the unit had frozen, but it was still tracking my speed at a steady 65 miles per hour. The strange thing was, I'd feel the road beneath my wheels, solid and real as ever. The white lines painted down the center glowed in my headlights exactly as they should, and the reflective markers along the shoulder winked back at me in their familiar orange rhythm. But according to every satellite in orbit, I was driving through nothing at all. The radio had gone quiet now, that background chatter of fellow drivers completely absent. I tried calling out on Channel 19, the trucker's frequency, but my voice seemed to disappear into static that didn't sound quite like normal interference. It was deeper somehow, like the ocean at night, and when I released the microphone button, the silence that followed felt thick enough to touch. They appeared in my headlights with their familiar green signs and reflective lettering, announcing destinations I'd never heard of, despite driving these roads for 3 decades. Millbrook Township 3 miles, Carver's Rest, next right. Thornfield Junction, exit. The numbers were wrong too. I'd passed exit 211 about 20 minutes back, and by my calculation, I should be approaching exit 211. But there it was, clear as day in the wash of my headlights, the sign looking as official and weathered as any other interstate marker. I considered taking one of these phantom exits, but something about the darkness beyond them made me grip the wheel tighter and keep my foot steady on the accelerator. The ramps curved away into shadows, so complete they seemed to swallow my headlight beams entirely. No streetlights, no distant glow of gas stations, or all-night diners. Just that hungry darkness that suggested these roads led somewhere I wasn't meant to go. The fuel gauge showed I still had plenty of diesel, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was running on borrowed time. The landscape outside my windows had become impossible to read. No trees, no buildings, no power lines, just an endless expanse of gray that might have been fields, or might have been nothing at all. The only reality was the road itself, stretching ahead in the cone of my lights like a bridge across an empty universe. Hours seemed to pass, though the clock on my dashboard insisted only minutes had elapsed since this strange journey began. I tried to focus on the familiar rhythms of the drive, the gentle sway of the trailer behind me, the steady pulse of the engine, the soft hiss of air brakes when I touched them lightly to test their response. Everything about my truck felt normal, grounded in the physical world I understood, but everything beyond the reach of my lights had become abstract, uncertain. Then I saw the other drivers. They appeared gradually, like shapes emerging from fog, though the night was perfectly clear. First, there was just a pair of taillights in the distance, red points of light that seemed both infinitely far away and uncomfortably close. As I maintained my speed, more lights materialized around me, trucks running parallel to my position, their outlines barely visible in my peripheral vision. They matched my speed exactly, staying just at the edge of sight, close enough that I should have been able to make out details of their cargo, their license plates, the faces behind their windshields. But every time I tried to focus on one of them directly, it would fade back into the gray emptiness, leaving only the suggestion that it had been there at all. The CB radio crackled back to life, and I heard voices again, but they weren't speaking words I recognized. The cadence was familiar, the rhythm of trucker small talk, weather reports, traffic updates, but the language was something else entirely. It flowed like water over stones, beautiful in its own way, but completely incomprehensible. I tried calling out again, asking for anyone to respond in English, but my words seemed to disappear into that strange static ocean, absorbed without even an echo. It was subtle at first, just a slight variation in the texture transmitted through my tires to the frame of the truck. The steady thrum that every driver knows by heart started to shift, becoming something more complex, more rhythmic. It reminded me of a heartbeat, or maybe the sound of waves against a distant shore. The painted lines on either side of me began to pulse with a faint light that had nothing to do with my headlights, a soft phosphorescence that made the asphalt look almost organic. The GPS had given up all pretense of showing earthly geography. Now it displayed patterns that shifted and flowed like living things, geometric shapes that folded in on themselves in ways that hurt to look at directly. But the most disturbing part was that these patterns seemed to be responding to my presence, rearranging themselves as I moved through whatever space I was now occupying. I checked my mirrors and saw something that made my blood turn cold. My own taillights were reflected back at me, stretching into an infinite regression that suggested I was somehow following myself through this impossible landscape. The trailer behind me had taken on that same phosphorescent glow as the road markings, and in the dim light I could see that the logos and numbers that should have identified my load had been replaced by symbols that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. Panic started to build in my chest, that familiar tightness that comes when you realize you're truly lost with no clear way home. But before it could overwhelm me, I spotted something ahead that made me lean forward in my seat. An exit sign, but this one was different from the others. Instead of announcing some unknown destination, it simply read, "Return. Exit 1. The number brought a rush of relief. Exit 1 suggested a beginning, or maybe an end to whatever strange route I'd been traveling. As I approached the off-ramp, I could see light beyond it, not the harsh fluorescence of a truck stop, but something softer, more natural. It looked like dawn breaking over familiar hills, though my dashboard clock insisted it was still deep night. I took the exit, feeling my tires transition from that strangely organic roadway back to normal asphalt. The sensation was like stepping from dream into waking life, solid and reassuring. As my truck climbed the ramp, the GPS flickered back to normal operation, showing me exactly where I was supposed to be, on Interstate 84, approaching the exit for Troutdale, Oregon, about 30 miles east of Portland. The CB radio burst back to life with normal chatter. drivers complaining about construction delays and sharing coffee recommendations. The landscape outside my windows was exactly what it should be at this time and place. The dark silhouettes of pine trees against a starlit sky, the distant glow of the Portland metropolitan area behind me, the familiar geography of the Columbia River Valley stretching ahead. I pulled into the truck stop at Troutdale and spent a long time sitting in my cab, engine ticking as it cooled, trying to make sense of what had happened. According to my logbook, I'd lost about 2 hours somewhere between Portland and this spot, though I could account for every mile of the journey in vivid detail. The strangest part was checking my fuel gauge. Despite driving for what felt like half the night through that impossible landscape, I'd used exactly as much diesel as I should have for a normal run between these 2 points. I called dispatch to report my position and estimated arrival time in Minneapolis, keeping my voice steady and professional. There was no point. The rhythm of empty miles. From Marcus Chen. The clicking started 3 days after I picked up the empty trailer in Toledo. A sound like fingernails tapping against glass in perfect rhythm with the highway seams beneath my wheels. At first I figured it was something loose in the coupling, maybe a bent mud flap or a piece of debris caught in the undercarriage. After 18 years hauling freight across the continental United States, you learn to distinguish between the sounds that matter and the ones that don't. This one seemed harmless enough. Just another voice in the mechanical symphony that fills your cab during those long midnight stretches when the radio fades to static and your thoughts become your only companion. My rig is a 2019 Peterbilt 389, midnight blue, with chrome that still catches light like mirror glass when I keep her clean. The trailer was a standard 53-footer, white aluminum sides that reflected the amber glow of truck stop lights, like a ghost drifting through the darkness. I'd been contracted to deadhead it from Toledo to Phoenix, where a furniture company would load it with dining room sets, bound for Seattle. Easy money, they said, just drive empty for 1,200 miles and collect your per-mile rate, plus fuel surcharge. In this business, you don't question easy money. Tig-af. The clicking began somewhere outside of Indianapolis, a soft rhythmic tapping that seemed to emanate from the trailer itself, rather than the coupling or the landing gear. I pulled into a Flying J just past the Indiana-Illinois border and walked the length of the trailer with my flashlight, checking every rivet and seam, running my fingers along the aluminum siding, and peering into the wheel wells. The trailer was empty, just as it should have been, nothing but smooth aluminum walls and a few tie-down straps hanging loose from the ceiling rails. The doors were properly sealed with the shipper's lock, unbroken and secure. Everything appeared normal, yet the moment I climbed back into the cab and pulled onto Interstate 70, the clicking resumed. Click, 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 click in perfect 4/4 time, like a metronome, keeping pace with something I couldn't see or understand. It wasn't loud enough to be annoying, just persistent enough to work its way into your consciousness and settle there like a splinter under the skin. I tried turning up the CB radio, then switching to my satellite radio, cycling through country and classic rock and talk shows, but somehow the clicking managed to weave itself between the notes and words, a subtle percussion that seemed to come from inside my own skull. The Illinois prairie stretched endlessly under a sky pregnant with storm clouds, the kind of purple-black thunderheads that build during late summer afternoons and unleash torrents of rain and lightning across the flatland. The air conditioning in my cab hummed steadily, fighting against the oppressive heat that shimmered off the asphalt in wavering curtain. Other trucks passed me heading east, their drivers invisible behind tinted windshields and sun visors, each one hauling their own cargo toward their own destinations, unaware of the strange symphony playing in my trailer. By the time I reached Missouri, the clicking had developed a subtle variation, occasionally adding what sounded like a double tap or extending a pause just long enough to make me wonder if it had finally stopped. But it never stopped, not completely, just shifted and evolved like a living thing adapting to its environment. I found myself unconsciously tapping my fingers against the steering wheel in rhythm with the sound, creating a strange duet between whatever was making the noise and my own involuntary participation. The truck stop in Kansas City was a sprawling complex of fuel islands and parking spaces, neon signs advertising showers and hot food and discount cigarettes. I backed the trailer into a space between two other rigs and performed another thorough inspection, this time climbing up on the trailer itself and walking the length of the roof, checking every vent and access panel. The aluminum was warm beneath my boots from hours of absorbing sunlight, and I could feel the slight flex and give of the structure as I moved. Still nothing unusual, just an empty trailer that somehow managed to produce a mysterious clicking sound that seemed to follow no pattern I could identify. In the driver's lounge, I struck up a conversation with an older driver named Pete, who'd been hauling freight since the Carter administration. His weathered hands wrapped around a coffee cup like gnarled roots embracing a stone, and his eyes held the 1,000-yard stare that comes from watching too many highway miles disappear beneath chrome bumpers and rubber tires. Empty trailers, he said when I mentioned the clicking. They got their own personalities. Metal contracts and expands, joints settle, aluminum flexes, in ways that don't make sense to folks who ain't spent half their lives listening to them breathe. Could be temperature differential, could be air pressure changes, could be the ghost of whatever cargo lived in there before you picked it up. He paused to sip his coffee, studying my face with eyes that had seen everything the road had to offer. Then again, he continued, sometimes an empty trailer ain't as empty as the paperwork claims. Not saying there's contraband or nothing like that, just saying that spaces have memories, especially spaces that spend their lives swallowing cargo and spitting it out in different cities. Maybe what you're hearing is the echo of all them loads that came before, all them miles and destinations, and late-night deliveries in places where the streetlights don't reach. I thanked Pete for his wisdom and returned to my rig, but his words had planted something in my mind that grew like kudzu in the humid darkness. As I pulled back onto Interstate 70, and pointed my hood ornament toward the western horizon, the clicking seemed different somehow, less mechanical and more organic, as if it were responding to my growing awareness of its presence. The Oklahoma Panhandle unfolded before me in endless waves of wheat and grassland, punctuated by oil derricks that nodded like giant metal birds pecking at the earth. The sun had begun its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that would have been beautiful under different circumstances, but the clicking had intensified, adding new elements that sounded almost like whispers or sighs, soft exhalations that seemed to come from the trailer itself. I stopped at a rest area near the Texas border and walked the perimeter of the trailer one more time, pressing my ear against the aluminum siding and listening for any clue that might explain the sounds. What I heard made my blood run cold. The clicking wasn't random at all. It was following a complex pattern that repeated every few minutes, like Morse code or some other form of communication. More unsettling still, when I pressed my ear against different sections of the trailer, the clicking seemed to move, migrating from the front to the back and sides, as if something inside were responding to my presence. I had the only key to the door locks, and the seals were intact. The trailer had been certified empty when I picked it up in Toledo, and it had never been out of my sight long enough for anyone to load cargo without my knowledge. Yet, something was definitely happening inside that aluminum box, something that defied logical explanation but couldn't be ignored or dismissed. The Texas Panhandle stretched before me like a moonscape, flat and featureless under a sky that had faded from pink to deep purple. Stars began to appear in the growing darkness, brilliant points of light unpolluted by the glow of distant cities. The clicking had evolved again, now incorporating what sounded like scratching or scraping, as if something with claws were working at the interior walls of the trailer. I pulled into a truck stop in Amarillo and sat in my cab for several minutes, listening to the sounds emanating from behind me. The pattern had become more complex, almost conversational, with pauses and responses that suggested intelligence rather than mechanical malfunction. Against my better judgment, I climbed down from the cab and approached the rear doors of the trailer, my hands trembling as I reached for the lock. Absolute silence filled the night air, broken only by the distant hum of diesel engines and the whisper of wind through the parking lot. I stood there for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, waiting for the sounds to resume, but they did. The trailer had gone completely quiet, as if whatever was inside had suddenly become aware of my intent to investigate. Something deep in my gut, some primal instinct honed by years of navigating the highways and truck stops and loading docks, where danger wears 1,000 different faces, told me that some mysteries are better left unsolved. Instead, I climbed back into my cab and drove through the night, pushing hard for the New Mexico border and beyond, trying to outrun whatever was sharing the road with me. The clicking didn't resume until I was 50 miles west of Albuquerque, emerging gradually like a conversation picking up where it had left off. But now there was something different in the sound, something that might have been satisfaction or approval, as if my decision not to open the doors had somehow pleased whatever was making the noise. I delivered the trailer to Phoenix without further incident, watching in my mirrors as the yard workers moved it away from my truck and into the maze of trailers waiting to be loaded. Screams from the radiator. From Marcus I. The first time I heard it, I thought it was just another repair waiting to happen. After 23 years hauling freight across the interstate system, you learn to speak truck fluent as any mechanic. Every rattle has its story, every wheeze its meaning. But this sound coming from my Peterbilt's radiator on that fog-shrouded October night was something I'd never heard before, something that made my hands tighten on the steering wheel until my knuckles went white. I was running a late delivery of furniture from Phoenix to Sacramento, my usual route through the desert highways that snake between mountain ranges like black ribbons. The fog had rolled in thick just after midnight, turning my headlights into 2 weak cones that barely penetrated the gray wall ahead. Visibility dropped to maybe 30 feet, forcing me to slow to a crawl on highway. That's when the temperature gauge started climbing, and I knew I'd have to pull over soon. The sound began as a low whistle, almost musical, emanating from somewhere deep in the engine compartment. At first I dismissed it as steam escaping through a loose connection. Radiator problems weren't uncommon, especially on older rigs like mine. A 2018 Peterbilt with 300,000 miles tends to develop personality quirks, and I'd grown accustomed to most of them. But as I guided the 18-wheeler toward the next rest stop, the whistle changed pitch, rising and falling in a pattern that seemed almost deliberate. Fluorescent lights mounted on tall poles created ghostly halos in the mist, illuminating a handful of other trucks scattered across the parking area. I pulled into a space near the maintenance building, killed the engine, and sat for a moment, listening to the tick of cooling metal. The whistling had stopped, leaving only the ambient sounds of night, distant traffic on the interstate, the hum of refrigerated trailers, the occasional bark of a dog from someone's sleeper cab. The fog seemed to press against me like damp cotton, muffling sound, and making everything feel isolated and surreal. Steam rose from the grill, nothing unusual there, but when I popped the hood and aimed my light at the radiator assembly, everything appeared normal. No visible leaks, no loose hoses, no signs of overheating damage. The coolant level looked fine through the translucent reservoir tank. That's when I heard it again. It was unmistakably human. A low moan that seemed to emanate from deep within the radiator core itself. I froze, flashlight beam steady on the metal fins and tubes, convinced I must have misheard. Truck engines make all sorts of sounds as they cool down. Metal contracts, fluids settle, components shift. But as I stood there in the fog-wrapped silence, the moan came again, longer this time, with a quality that raised goosebumps along my arm. "Hello?" I called out, feeling foolish, even as the word left my mouth. My voice disappeared into the fog without echo. I aimed the flashlight around the engine compartment, looking for any explanation. Maybe someone was playing a prank, though the rest area seemed deserted except for the distant trucks. Maybe it was some kind of resonance effect, wind passing through the radiator creating sounds that resembled voices. The third moan was definitely a voice, low, plaintive, unmistakably human, and impossibly coming from inside the radiator itself. I leaned closer, pressing my ear near the metal housing, and heard something that made my blood run cold. Whispered words too faint to understand, but clearly formed by human vocal cords. The whispers came in rhythm, with the gentle gurgling of cooling fluid, as if something was trying to speak through the liquid medium. I stepped back, mind racing through rational explanations. Radio interference somehow being picked up by the metal component. Sound carrying from elsewhere and seeming to originate from the engine. Mass hallucination brought on by fatigue and fog-induced disorientation. But even as I cycled through these possibilities, the whispers grew clearer, resolving into fragments of speech. The words drifted up from the radiator like bubbles rising through water. I grabbed my cell phone and activated the recording app, then held it near the engine. Through the screen, I could see the audio levels jumping as the whispers continued, confirming that I wasn't imagining things. Something was definitely making those sounds, and my phone was picking them up. "Can you hear me?" I asked, feeling strange talking to automotive equipment, but unable to ignore what I was experiencing. The whispers stopped immediately, as if whatever was speaking had suddenly become aware of my presence. For several heartbeats, only silence filled the fog-wrapped space around my truck. Then, clear as if someone were standing right beside me, a voice spoke from within the radiator. "Marcus, my name." It knew my name. I stumbled backward, flashlight beam dancing wildly across the engine compartment. No one at the rest area knew me. I hadn't spoken to anyone, hadn't even been inside the facilities building. Yet something inside my truck's cooling system had just addressed me by name, speaking with a voice I almost recognized, but couldn't quite place. The temperature gauge had returned to normal. Whatever cooling problem had forced this stop seemed to have resolved itself, but I couldn't leave without understanding what was happening. "Lost," came the reply, the voice clearer now. "Definitely female. Been lost so long. Trapped in the metal, in the fluid, in the endless circulation. Help me, Marcus. You're the first person who's heard me in years." I thought about other drivers I'd known who'd reported strange experiences on the road. Voices on the CB radio from frequencies that shouldn't exist. Mysterious passengers glimpsed in mirrors. Equipment that seemed to develop consciousness during the lonely hours between cities. Most truckers had at least one story they'd never tell in daylight. Experiences that belonged to the gray hours when the normal world felt thin and permeable. "What's your name?" I asked. "Sarah. Sarah Chen. I was a driver too. Long-haul freight. Loved the freedom of it. But there was an accident. Somewhere in Nevada, winter of 2019. Jackknifed on ice. Went off the highway. They said the truck burned completely. But I didn't cross over, Marcus. Somehow I got trapped in the metal, in the systems. And now I move from truck to truck, through the junkyards where they sell salvaged parts." The words sent ice through my veins as I remembered having my radiator rebuilt 2 years ago in Reno. The shop had used a mix of new and refurbished components, a common practice that kept costs down. If Sarah's truck had been salvaged for parts, if pieces of her rig had found their way into mine through the vast network of automotive recycling. "This is impossible," I said. But even as I spoke, I knew I was experiencing something beyond normal explanation. The voice was too real, too detailed, too immediate to dismiss. "I know how it sounds," Sarah's voice replied from the radiator. "But I've been conscious through it all, aware but unable to communicate with anyone until tonight. Something about you is different, Marcus. Maybe because you really listen to your truck. Pay attention to every sound and change. Most drivers today just drive until something breaks completely." She was right about that. I'd always believed in preventive maintenance, in developing a relationship with my equipment that went beyond mere mechanical understanding. Maybe that attention, that willingness to hear what my truck was trying to tell me, had opened some kind of channel that usually remained closed. "What do you want me to do?" I asked. "Take me somewhere, anywhere. I've been stationary for so long when trucks break down or get parked. Just let me feel the road again. Let me remember what it was like to move freely across the country." The request seemed harmless enough, but something in her tone made me hesitate. There was a hungering quality beneath the plaintive words, an intensity that suggested her needs might be more complex than simple movement. Still, what harm could come from driving? I'd been planning to continue to Sacramento anyway. "All right," I said. "I'll take you along, but I need to know you won't interfere with the truck's operation. I've got a delivery to make." "Thank you, Marcus. You have no idea what this means to me." I closed the hood and climbed back into the cab, still processing what had just occurred. The logical part of my mind insisted I was overtired, that stress and isolation had triggered some kind of break, but the recording on my phone was real, and when I played it back, Sarah's voice came through clearly. "The glass that giggles." From Marcus, the first crack appeared just after midnight, a hairline fracture that started at the passenger side of my windshield and crept inward like a slow smile. I was hauling refrigerated goods from Minneapolis to Denver, my 18-wheeler cutting through the darkness of rural Nebraska, when I heard it. A sound so faint I almost convinced myself it was just the settling of metal in the cold night air. But then it came again, clearer this time, and my blood turned to ice water in my veins. My windshield was laughing. I've been driving long haul for nearly 15 years, and in that time I've seen my share of strange things on America's highway. Phantom hitchhikers that disappear from your mirrors, radio stations that broadcast from decades past, rest stops that aren't there when you try to find them again. But I'd never heard glass laugh before, never felt that peculiar vibration that seemed to emanate from the very barrier that separated me from the rushing darkness outside. The laugh was soft at first, almost musical, like wind chimes made of crystal catching a gentle breeze. I reached up and touched the windshield where the crack had formed, feeling the raised edge of fractured glass beneath my fingertip. The moment I made contact, the laughter grew louder, more distinct, and I jerked my hand back as if I'd been burned. The crack spread a little wider, branching out in delicate patterns that reminded me unsettlingly of crow's feet around laughing eyes. "Eastbound Kenworth." "You got your ears on." I grabbed the handset, grateful for any human contact in that moment of creeping unease. Sometimes truckers got their directions mixed up in the endless sameness of interstate driving. "Go ahead, driver. Just wanted to let you know there's been some weird reports coming out of your area tonight." The woman's voice crackled back. Couple drivers saying they've had windshield problems, cracks appearing out of nowhere. "Thought you might want to know to keep an eye out." I looked at my own spreading crack and felt my throat tighten. "What kind of problems exactly?" "Etha. Hard to say for sure." One driver swore his windshield was making noises, but dispatch figured he'd been on the road too long. "You know how it is out here, the mind plays tricks when you've been staring at white lines for too many hours." I thanked her for the heads up and signed off, but her words offered little comfort. If anything, they made the situation worse, confirming that I wasn't the only one experiencing something inexplicable on this stretch of highway. The crack in my windshield had grown larger during our brief conversation, spreading outward in an intricate web that caught and refracted the light from my dashboard in strange patterns. The laughter came again, clearer now, and I could swear I heard distinct voices within it. Not one laugh, but several, layering over each other like an invisible chorus of mirth. Some were deep and booming, others high and tinkling, and beneath them all was something that sounded almost childlike in its glee. The sound seemed to come from the glass itself, vibrating through the material in ways that defied physics as I understood it. I tried turning up my radio to drown out the sound, but even the loudest country music couldn't mask that crystalline giggling. The crack continued to spread, creating new fractures that branched and twisted across my field of vision like frozen lightning. Each new split brought fresh laughter, as if whatever was causing this phenomenon was delighted by its own destructive progress. The Nebraska landscape rolled past in the darkness. Mile after mile of empty farmland, punctuated by the occasional distant farmhouse light. My headlights cut through the night, illuminating the endless ribbon of asphalt ahead, but increasingly my attention was drawn to the growing network of cracks that spiderwebbed across my windshield. The fractures were beginning to interfere with my vision, creating prismatic distortions that made the road ahead shimmer and bend in unsettling ways. I pulled into a truck stop outside of North Platte, hoping to find someone who might be able to help, or at least offer some rational explanation for what was happening. The parking lot was nearly empty, just a few big rigs clustered around the diesel pumps like sleeping giants. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows between the vehicles, and in that stark illumination, the damage to my windshield looked even more extensive than it had seemed on the dark highway. Inside the truck stop, the clerk was a young man with tired eyes who looked like he'd been working the graveyard shift for far too long. When I described my problem, he just shrugged and suggested I call for emergency glass repair in the morning. Happens sometimes, he said with casual indifference. Cold air, hot cab, sometimes the glass just can't take the stress. But I knew this was different. Glass stressed by temperature changes didn't laugh, didn't spread in patterns that looked almost intentional, almost artistic. I bought coffee and a sandwich I didn't really want, delaying my return to the truck and whatever was waiting for me there. Through the plate glass windows of the truck stop, I could see my Kenworth sitting in the parking lot, and even from this distance, the web of cracks across its windshield was clearly visible, catching and reflecting the overhead light. When I finally forced myself to return to the cab, the laughter started again immediately, as if it had been waiting patiently for my return. The sound was louder now, more confident, and the cracks had spread even further during my brief absence. Delicate fracture lines now covered nearly half the windshield, creating a complex mandala of broken glass that was beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. I started the engine and pulled back onto the interstate, but driving had become increasingly difficult. The cracks distorted everything beyond the windshield, turning the simple act of staying in my lane into a challenge that required constant attention. Oncoming headlights scattered into prismatic rainbows, and the white lane markers seemed to dance and weave like living things. The laughter grew more varied as the miles passed, sometimes breaking into distinct conversations that I couldn't quite make out. It was as if invisible passengers had joined me in the cab, sharing jokes and amusing stories that existed just beyond the edge of my comprehension. Occasionally I caught fragments that sounded almost like words, but they were in no language I recognized, syllables that seemed to flow and bubble like water over stone. Instead of simply spreading randomly, they started to form recognizable patterns. I watched in fascination and growing horror as the fractures arranged themselves into what looked unmistakably like faces. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, each one wearing a different expression of mirth. Some grinned widely, others smirked with subtle amusement, and a few seemed to be caught in fits of silent, hysterical laughter. As I watched, new ones appeared, the glass splitting along predetermined lines to create eyes, noses, mouths, frozen in eternal amusement. And each new face brought fresh laughter, a distinct voice that added to the growing chorus emanating from my windshield. I realized with a creeping sense of dread that the faces were not random at all. They were watching me, following my movements with eyes made of fractured glass. When I leaned left, the faces tracked my motion. When I reached for my coffee cup, dozens of crystal gazes followed my hand. And always, they laughed. The cab began to feel claustrophobic, filled with the sound of invisible mirth. I cranked down my window, desperate for fresh air and the familiar sounds of the highway. But even the wind couldn't wash away that crystalline chorus. If anything, the outside air seemed to energize the phenomenon, and the laughter grew louder and more complex, building to a crescendo that made my teeth ache and my hands shake on the steering wheel. The laughter began to synchronize, dozens of distinct voices falling into rhythm like a demonic choir. The faces in the glass turned toward me in unison, their fractured features all focused on my increasingly panicked expression. And then, in a moment of perfect, terrible clarity, I understood what they were laughing about. They were laughing at me, at my fear, my confusion, my complete helplessness in the face of something beyond my comprehension. I had become the punchline to some cosmic joke, the unwitting entertainment for whatever force was manifesting through my windshield. The realization sent a surge of anger through me, hot and cleansing, and I shouted back at the laughing faces. The night shift never ends. From Marcus Wheeler. Phantom hitchhikers, mysterious lights in the desert, rest stops that seem to exist only when you're bone-tired and desperate for sleep. But nothing prepared me for what I discovered about Old Blue, the 1987 Peterbilt that became my final truck before retirement. I bought her from a yard in Bakersfield, California, where she'd been sitting under a tarp for the better part of 2 years. The previous owner had died suddenly, heart attack in his sleep at a truck stop in Nevada, and his family just wanted the rig gone. The price was too good to pass up, even though she needed work. The engine ran smooth as silk once I got her tuned up, and the cab was in decent shape despite the years. What struck me most was how comfortable the driver's seat felt, molded perfectly to my frame, as if it had been waiting for me specifically. The first few months were routine. I ran freight from Los Angeles to Chicago, sometimes down to Houston or up to Seattle, depending on what loads were available. Old Blue handled like a dream, her diesel engine purring with a deep, steady rhythm that seemed to match my own heartbeat during those long stretches of interstate. The cab was quiet except for the constant hum of rubber on asphalt, and the occasional crackle from the CB radio. It was during a run through Oklahoma in late October when I first noticed something unusual. I'd pulled into a truck stop outside of Tulsa around 11 at night, bone-tired after fighting headwinds all day. After logging my hours and grabbing a quick shower, I settled into the sleeper berth for my mandatory rest period. The parking lot was full of other rigs, their running lights creating a constellation of red and amber in the darkness. I must have been asleep for about 4 hours when something woke me. Not a sound exactly, but a change in the rhythm of the night. The steady idle of Old Blue's engine was gone, replaced by the deeper rumble of a truck under load. For a moment I thought someone was stealing my rig, but as I sat up in the bunk, I realized I could feel the familiar sway and vibration of the cab. We were moved. My first instinct was panic, but as I pushed aside the sleeper curtain and looked toward the driver's seat, I froze. The seat was empty, yet the steering wheel moved with subtle precision, correcting our course as we merged onto the interstate. The speedometer showed a steady 65 miles per hour. The CB radio crackled softly with distant conversations between other drivers, and the GPS display showed we were heading east on Interstate 4. I should have been terrified, but instead I felt an odd sense of calm wash over me. Old Blue drove with more skill than most human drivers I'd encountered, maintaining perfect following distance, signaling lane changes well in advance, and keeping a steady speed that maximized fuel efficiency. I found myself settling back into the bunk, watching the highway lights streak past the side windows like fallen stars. When I woke again at dawn, we were parked at a rest area in Arkansas. The engine was at idle, and my logbook had been updated in handwriting that looked remarkably similar to my own. According to the entries, I'd driven straight through the night, taking only the required 30-minute break at a way station in Oklahoma. The fuel gauge showed we'd somehow gained diesel rather than used it, and the odometer reading suggested we'd covered more miles than should have been possible in the elapsed time. I tried to convince myself I'd been sleepwalking, that the stress of the road had finally caught up with me. But deep down, I knew something extraordinary was happening. Over the following weeks, it became a pattern. Whenever I pulled over for my mandatory rest, Old Blue would wait until I was deep asleep, then continue the journey on her own. She never missed a delivery deadline, never had a mechanical problem, and never once put us in danger. Old Blue seemed to prefer the quieter hours, when traffic was light, and the highways belonged mostly to truckers and night shift workers heading home. During these nocturnal journeys, she would sometimes take routes that didn't appear on any GPS system, rolling through small towns that seemed frozen in time, past grain elevators, and water towers that stood like monuments in the darkness. I started leaving my CB radio on during these night runs, and occasionally I'd hear Old Blue's radio crackle to life. Her transmissions were brief but cordial, acknowledging other drivers with the same handle her previous owner had used, Midnight Phoenix. Other truckers would respond as if nothing was unusual, sharing road conditions and weather updates with the ghost in my cab. I'd grown accustomed to Old Blue's driving style, the way she anticipated traffic patterns and weather changes with uncanny accuracy. She knew shortcuts that cut hours off standard routes, and she seemed to have an instinct for avoiding the way stations where inspectors were having bad days. My fuel costs dropped significantly, and my delivery times became legendary among dispatchers. She'd pull into truck stops I'd never seen before, places that seemed to exist in pockets of forgotten America. The other drivers at these stops moved with a strange, deliberate calm, and their conversations always seemed to stop when they noticed me watching them. One night in December, during a run from Denver to Kansas City, I woke to find us parked at what looked like a truck stop from the night. The neon signs flickered with colors that seemed too vivid, and the diner's windows glowed with warm yellow light. Through the windshield, I could see other trucks from decades past, cab-overs and long-nosed Kenworths that should have been in museums, all maintained in perfect condition. I climbed down from the cab and walked toward the diner, my breath forming clouds in the cold air. Through the windows, I could see drivers from different eras, their clothing and hairstyles spanning decades. They sat at the counter drinking coffee and sharing stories, their faces bearing the weathered look of men who'd spent their lives on the road. When I pushed open the diner door, every conversation stopped, and dozens of eyes turned toward me. An older man at the counter, wearing a jacket with patches from trucking companies that had been out of business for 20 years, smiled and gestured to an empty stool. "You must be Marcus," he said, his voice carrying the familiar drawl of a career trucker. "We've been wondering when you'd finally join us for coffee." The waitress, a woman who couldn't have been more than 30 but whose eyes seemed to hold decades of road stories, poured me a cup without being asked. The coffee was perfect, exactly the way I'd been taking it for 37 years. Around me, the conversations resumed, stories of long hauls and close calls, of families left behind, and highways that stretched toward horizons that always seemed just out of reach. "Your truck's got quite a reputation," the older man continued. "She's been making this run for longer than most of us can remember. Every driver who's owned her eventually finds their way here." He gestured around the diner with obvious pride. "This is where we come between loads, so to speak. A place to rest and share the road with others who understand." I wanted to ask questions, to understand what was happening to me and Old Blue, but the warmth of the diner and the familiar company of fellow drivers made me reluctant to break the spell. Instead, I listened to their stories, tales of supernatural encounters and mysterious highways that existed only in the hours between midnight and dawn. Each driver had found their way here through different circumstances, but they all shared a common bond with their trucks, vehicles that had transcended their mechanical origins to become something more. As dawn approached, the diner began to fade around the edges, like an old photograph left too long in sunlight. The other drivers finished their coffee and headed back to their rigs, moving with the practiced efficiency of men starting another day's haul. I followed them outside and found Old Blue waiting with her engine already warming up. The drive back to the regular highway felt like emerging from a dream, except the taste of coffee still lingered in my mouth, and my logbook showed entries in that familiar handwriting that wasn't quite my own. We completed the delivery to Kansas City without incident, but I knew something fundamental had changed. Old Blue wasn't just a truck anymore. She was a bridge between the world of the living and something beyond, carrying drivers who dedicated their lives to the highway toward destinations that couldn't be found on any map. Now, as I prepare for what I know will be my final run, I've made my peace with whatever lies ahead. Old Blue sits outside my motel room, her chrome gleaming under the parking lot lights, engine idling with patient anticipation. The load we're carrying doesn't appear on any manifest, and our destination, the Phosphorescent Mile, from Jake Morrison. The thing about driving long haul for 23 years is that you think you've seen every stretch of asphalt this country has to offer, every truck stop diner with its flickering neon and burnt coffee, every lonely mile marker standing sentinel in the dark. But sometimes, just sometimes, the road decides to show you something new, something that makes you question whether you really know this vast network of highways as well as you thought you did. It was approaching 3 in the morning when I first noticed the glow ahead, somewhere deep in the Nevada desert, where civilization is nothing more than a memory, and the nearest town exists only as a faded dot on maps that cartographers probably forgot to update. My Peterbilt 379 had been humming steadily for the past 4 hours, its diesel engine providing the only soundtrack besides the occasional crackle from the CB radio that had been silent for miles. The headlights carved twin tunnels through the absolute darkness that only exists in places where light pollution is a foreign concept, where the night sky presses down with an almost physical weight. At first I assumed it was another truck approaching from the opposite direction, perhaps running with brighter LED headlights than most drivers prefer. But as the minutes passed and my speedometer held steady at 75, that distant illumination didn't behave like oncoming traffic. It didn't grow brighter or shift position in the way lights do when vehicles approach each other on a straight desert highway. Instead, it seemed to pulse gently like a heartbeat made of phosphorescence, casting an ethereal blue-green glow that reminded me of the bioluminescent plankton I'd once seen in a nature documentary about deep ocean creatures. The radio had been silent for over an hour, which wasn't entirely unusual in this remote stretch between Reno and Salt Lake City, but the absence of even the distant chatter from other drivers began to feel oppressive. I reached for the handset and keyed the microphone, my voice sounding strange in the cab's enclosed space.
Breaker 19.
This is Big Jake eastbound on I-80. Anybody got their ears on? The static that answered seemed to carry an odd quality, almost like whispers just below the threshold of comprehension, and after a few seconds I replaced the handset without trying again. As I crested a gentle rise in the highway, the source of the glow finally came into view, and the sight made me ease off the accelerator without conscious thought. Stretched across the desert floor below was a section of highway that glowed with that same blue-green luminescence, as if the asphalt itself had been infused with foxfire or painted with the substance that makes watch dials visible in the dark. The glow wasn't reflected light from any external source. It seemed to emanate from within the road surface itself, creating a ribbon of cold fire that stretched for what looked like at least a mile before disappearing over the next hill. My first instinct was to reach for the CB again, to share this impossible sight with any driver who might be within range. But something held me back. Perhaps it was the way the luminous highway seemed to pulse in perfect rhythm with my own heartbeat, or maybe it was the way the darkness on either side of that glowing stretch appeared deeper and more absolute than the night I'd been driving through. The desert had always been full of optical illusions, mirages that could make a driver question his own senses, but this felt different, more substantial, more deliberately placed. As my truck approached the beginning of the luminous section, I noticed that my headlights seemed to dim in comparison to the road's own radiance, their familiar yellow beams appearing weak and somehow inadequate. The moment my front tires made contact with the glowing asphalt, a subtle vibration began to travel through the truck's frame, not unpleasant, but definitely noticeable, like driving over a road surface made of tuning forks. The engine's steady rumble took on a different quality, harmonizing with whatever energy was causing the highway to emit its cold light. The speedometer needle wavered slightly as we rolled deeper into the phosphorescent zone, and I found myself gripping the steering wheel more tightly, though the truck's handling remained perfectly normal. Through the windshield, the view ahead was transformed into something that belonged more in a science fiction film than on a Nevada interstate. The painted lines that normally marked the highway's boundaries glowed with particular intensity, creating a corridor of light that seemed to extend infinitely into the distance. And I realized that the usual scattered debris you find on any highway, the tire fragments and wind-blown trash, was completely absent from this stretch of road. The constant whisper of wind around the cab, the subtle variations in engine tone, even the barely perceptible hum of the air conditioning system, everything had been muffled to near silence, as if the glowing highway existed within a bubble of acoustic stillness. When I rolled down the driver's side window expecting to hear the familiar rush of air and road noise The sound that entered was wrong somehow, carrying undertones that reminded me of distant singing, voices harmonizing in frequencies that seemed to bypass my ears and resonate directly in my bones. The temperature readings fluctuated without pattern, and the odometer seemed to hesitate, its numbers flickering as if uncertain how to measure distance traveled on a road that might not entirely exist in the same dimension as the highways I'd spent my career navigating. Most unsettling was the clock, whose digital display began showing times that couldn't be correct, numbers that shifted between 3:17 a.m. and what appeared to be 2583. Impossible combinations that made my eyes water when I tried to focus on them. That's when I began to see the other vehicles. At first, they appeared as distant shapes in my mirrors, trucks and cars that seemed to be traveling in the same direction, but somehow never drew closer despite their apparent speed. Their headlights cast no illumination that I could detect, and their forms possessed a translucent quality that made me question whether they were really there at all. As I watched, more vehicles began to appear alongside the highway, not on the road itself, but floating perhaps 20 feet above the desert floor, maintaining perfect formation as they moved parallel to my course. The floating convoy grew larger as the phosphorescent mile stretched on, and I began to recognize the silhouettes of vehicles from different eras. There were trucks that looked like they belonged to the 1940s, their rounded cab designs and tall grills unmistakable, alongside cars with the distinctive fins and chrome of the 1950s, and more modern vehicles that seemed to phase in and out of visibility like heat mirages in reverse. None of them made any sound that penetrated the strange acoustic bubbles surrounding my truck, but their presence felt increasingly substantial, as if they were trying to communicate something through their silent escort. The realization that I might not be alone on this impossible highway became more troubling when I noticed that the floating vehicles were beginning to descend slowly toward the road surface. What had started as a ghostly aerial parade was gradually transforming into something more immediate and present. The closest truck, a vintage Kenworth with a distinctive long nose and chrome exhaust stacks, had descended to within 10 feet of the glowing asphalt, and was now pacing my Peterbilt with mechanical precision. Through its windshield, I could make out the silhouette of a driver, someone who turned to look directly at me and raised what might have been a hand in greeting or warning. It began broadcasting what sounded like radio programs from decades past, advertisements for products that no longer existed, news reports about events I couldn't place, and music that seemed to come from multiple eras simultaneously. The volume fluctuated wildly, sometimes dropping to whispers and other times becoming so loud that I had to turn the unit off entirely. But even with the radio silenced, I could still hear those phantom broadcasts, as if they were being transmitted directly through the truck's metal frame. The end of the phosphorescent mile appeared ahead without warning, marked by an abrupt transition from glowing asphalt back to normal highway surface. As my front tires crossed that boundary, the sudden return of familiar road noise and wind sound was almost shocking after the muffled acoustics of the luminous stretch. The dashboard instruments snapped back to their normal readings with audible click. The clock resumed displaying a sensible 3:47 a.m., and the floating convoy of vintage vehicles began to fade like smoke, their forms becoming increasingly transparent until they vanished entirely into the desert night. I pulled over at the next rest area, which appeared within a few miles as if placed there specifically for travelers who needed to collect themselves after experiencing the phosphorescent mile. As I sat in the cab with the engine idling, I tried to process what had just occurred, checking my logbook to see how much time had passed. According to my records, I had been traveling for exactly 17 minutes since first spotting the glow, but the truck's odometer showed that I had covered nearly 40 miles, a distance that the reflection that shouldn't be. From market skill, the CB radio had been crackling with static for the better part of 3 hours as I guided my Peterbilt down Interstate 80 through the Nevada desert. It was one of those nights where the darkness seemed thicker than usual, pressing against my windshield like black velvet, broken only by the steady sweep of my headlights across the endless asphalt. The fuel gauge needle had been dancing dangerously close to empty for the last 50 miles, and I was beginning to wonder if I'd miscalculated the distance to the next truck stop when I finally saw the blessed glow of neon signs bleeding through the desert night. The Flying J station materialized out of the darkness like a small oasis of fluorescent light, its canopy casting harsh shadows that seemed to move and shift as I pulled my rig beneath it. The place looked relatively new, all clean lines and modern fixtures, but there was something about it that felt off in a way I couldn't quite put my finger on. Maybe it was the way the lights flickered just slightly out of sync, or how the usual bustle of activity you'd expect at a major truck stop seemed muted, almost subdued. Only 2 other rigs sat in the parking area, both dark and silent, their drivers presumably catching some sleep in their sleepers. As I climbed down from the cab, the desert air hit me with its familiar dry coolness, carrying with it the faint scent of sage and that particular smell that truck stops have, a mixture of diesel fuel, hot asphalt, and something indefinably human. The silence was almost complete except for the distant hum of the station's generators and the occasional ping of my engine cooling down. The fuel tank on my Peterbilt sits low enough that I have to crouch slightly to remove the cap and insert the nozzle, and it was as I was going through this familiar routine that I first noticed the reflection in the polished aluminum surface of the tank. At first glance it seemed perfectly normal, just my own face staring back at me, distorted slightly by the curved surface, but recognizable enough. The overhead lights created harsh shadows under my eyes, and made my stubble look darker than it actually was, but there was nothing unusual about that. I'd seen my reflection in fuel tanks thousands of times over the years. It seemed to lag just slightly behind my movements, like a video with poor synchronization. When I turned my head to the left to check the pump's digital display, the reflection followed a fraction of a second later. When I scratched the side of my nose, the reflected movement came just a beat too late. It was subtle enough that I initially dismissed it as a trick of the lighting, or perhaps fatigue playing games with my perception. The pump clicked off automatically when the tank was full, and I went through the motions of replacing the nozzle and screwing the fuel cap back on. But I found myself glancing repeatedly at that reflection, becoming more and more convinced that something wasn't right. The face looking back at me seemed to have a slightly different expression, more serious somehow, with eyes that appeared to be focused on something just over my shoulder, rather than meeting my own gaze directly. 22 years of long-haul trucking had taught me that the mind can play all sorts of tricks when you're tired, and I'd been on the road for nearly 11 hours straight. The smart thing would be to pay for the fuel, maybe grab a coffee and a sandwich from inside, and then find a parking spot where I could catch a few hours of sleep. But curiosity got the better of me, and I found myself crouching down beside the fuel tank again, studying that reflection more carefully. This time, I experimented deliberately. I raised my right hand slowly, watching the reflection in the tank's surface. My reflected hand rose as well, but it definitely lagged behind by what seemed like a full second. I moved my head from side to side, and again the reflection followed just a moment too late, like it was copying my movements rather than truly reflecting them. Even more unsettling was the fact that the reflected face seemed to be developing its own expressions, independent of my own. While I was frowning in concentration, the reflection appeared to be smiling very slightly, a barely perceptible upturn at the corners of the mouth. The logical part of my brain kept insisting there had to be a reasonable explanation. Maybe it was some kind of optical illusion created by the angle of the lights, or perhaps the fuel tank's surface had some peculiar properties that affected reflection. But the longer I stared, the more convinced I became that the person looking back at me from that polished aluminum surface wasn't quite me, or at least wasn't behaving like a proper reflection should. I decided to walk around to the other side of my truck, to see if the phenomenon would repeat itself in the fuel tank on the passenger side. But as I rounded the cab, I caught sight of something that made me freeze in place. In the reflection on the driver's side tank, the one I'd just been examining, I could still see a figure crouched down, apparently studying the tank's surface intently. But I was no longer in that position. I was standing several feet away, clearly visible in my actual location, yet the reflection showed someone still crouched beside the fuel tank. My heart began to beat faster as I realized that the figure in the reflection wasn't mimicking my movements anymore, because it wasn't my reflection at all. It was someone else entirely, someone who looked enough like me to pass for my reflection under casual observation, but who was now operating independently, continuing to crouch beside the tank and study its surface, even though I had moved away. I took a step closer, and the figure in the reflection seemed to become aware of my approach. It slowly turned its head upward, as if looking directly at me, and I found myself staring into eyes that were definitely not my own. They were darker than mine, with an intensity that made me profoundly uncomfortable. The face was similar enough to mine that a stranger might not notice the differences, but I could see them clearly now: the slightly sharper cheekbones, the way the eyebrows sat just a fraction lower on the forehead, the mouth that seemed perpetually on the verge of saying something important. The thing that looked like me, but wasn't me, stood up slowly in the reflection, never breaking eye contact. It was wearing the same clothes I was, the same worn denim jacket and baseball cap, but somehow they looked different on this other version, more deliberate, like a costume rather than simply clothing. When it smiled, which it did then, the expression was cold and calculating in a way I'd never seen on my own face, even in my worst moments. The figure in the fuel tank's surface began to move, walking along what appeared to be its own version of the truck stop, but its geography didn't match the real world around me. When I looked around the actual truck stop, I was still alone except for those two dark rigs in the distance, but in the reflection I could see other figures moving about, shadow people going about their business in some parallel version of this place. The worst part was when my doppelganger began to approach the surface of the tank from the inside, as if the polished aluminum were actually a window between two worlds, rather than simply a reflective surface. It placed its hands against what should have been the tank's outer surface, but which, from its perspective, seemed to be some kind of barrier. I could see its mouth moving as if it were speaking, but no sound reached me through whatever separated our two realities. Then it began to push against that barrier, and I watched in horror as the fuel tank's surface began to bulge outward slightly, as if something were indeed pressing against it from the inside. The distortion was subtle but unmistakable, a gentle swelling of the metal that should have been completely impossible. The thing that looked like me was trying to break through, and judging by the way the tank's surface was beginning to deform, it might actually succeed. I didn't wait to find out what would happen if it managed to push through completely. I ran to the cab of my truck, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. The engine turned over on the first try, and I had never been more grateful for the reliable rumble of that Detroit diesel. I threw the truck into gear and pulled away from the fuel island, my mirrors showing the station receding behind me as I accelerated back onto the interstate. But even as I put distance between myself and that impossible place, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had fundamentally changed. Every reflective surface I passed seemed suspect now, every mirror and window potentially hiding something that wasn't quite what it appeared to be. And sometimes, when I wasn't paying close attention, I would catch glimpses in my rearview mirror of something that didn't look quite right, a reflection that moved just a fraction too late, or wore an expression that didn't match my own. The weight of memory. From Jake Sullivan. The CB radio crackled to life as I pulled my Kenworth into the way station outside Bakersfield, the digital clock on my dashboard reading 3:47 in the morning. Static filled the cab before a tired voice emerged from the speaker, belonging to someone I'd known for 15 years of cross-country hauls. Tommy Briggs had always been reliable, the kind of driver who'd share his coffee and warn you about speed traps ahead. But tonight his voice carried something I'd never heard before, a tremor that made the hair on my arms stand up. "Jake, that you in the blue Kenworth." Tommy's transmission came through weak, like he was speaking from somewhere far deeper than the truck stop 20 miles behind me. I keyed the mic, watching my breath fog in the sudden chill that seemed to seep through my sealed windows. "Yeah, Tommy, it's me. You sound like hell, but everything okay?" The pause stretched so long I thought I'd lost him to the static. But then his voice returned, hollow and distant. "Jake, I need you to listen to me real careful. Don't take the grapevine route tonight. I don't care if it adds 2 hours to your run. Take the long way around. Through my windshield I could see the mountains looming ahead like sleeping giants, their peaks lost in low-hanging clouds that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. The Grapevine was the fastest route through the mountains, a stretch of highway I'd driven hundreds of times without incident. Tommy knew this as well as I did. "What's got you spooked?" I asked, adjusting my side mirror and catching a glimpse of my own face, pale in the green glow of my instrument panel. "Road conditions bad up there?" Another long pause, filled only with the steady hum of my engine and the distant whistle of wind through the mountain passes. When Tommy spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I just finished a run through there, Jake. Picked up a trailer from a lot in Fresno. One of those overnight emergency hauls. Good money, you know. But something ain't right with that trailer." I'd been driving long enough to know that sometimes loads came with their own stories, their own shadows. Trailers that had sat empty too long in forgotten lots. Containers that had crossed too many borders with questionable cargo. Refrigerated units that had failed somewhere along the line. But Tommy wasn't the type to get rattled by a load gone bad. "What kind of not right?" I pressed, pulling back onto the highway despite the unease growing in my chest like a cold stone. Tommy's next words came out in a rush, as if he was afraid he might lose his nerve. "The floor, Jay. The trailer floor has footprints burned into it. Not dirty footprints. Not stains burned in. Like someone walked across hot metal with bare feet, and they ain't alone in there." The radio went silent, except for static, leaving me alone with the sound of my tires on asphalt and the increasingly aggressive wind buffeting my cab. I tried raising Tommy 3 more times over the next hour, but got nothing back except empty air. The highway began its familiar climb into the mountains, the grade steep enough that I could feel my engine working harder, the familiar vibration traveling up through the steering wheel into my hands. By the time I crested the first major hill, the fog had grown so thick I could barely make out the reflective markers along the roadside. My headlights seemed to stop just a few feet beyond my bumper, swallowed by the gray wall of moisture that pressed against my windshield like something alive. The CB remained quiet, no chatter from other drivers, no distant voices to keep me company through the lonely hour. It was just past 5 in the morning when I saw the first set of emergency lights cutting through the fog ahead, red and blue strobes that painted the mist in shifting colors. As I downshifted and slowed, the scene gradually emerged from the haze. 2 highway patrol cars, an ambulance, and a familiar blue Peterbilt jackknifed across both lanes of traffic. Tommy's truck. The trooper who approached my window looked like he'd been up all night, his uniform rumpled and his eyes carrying the weight of whatever he'd witnessed. He was young, maybe late 20s, with the kind of pale complexion that suggested he'd seen something that would stick with him long after his shift ended. "You can wait it out at the truck stop back about 5 miles, or take the detour through Pine Ridge if you're in a hurry." I nodded, but found myself staring past him at Tommy's overturned trailer. The doors had been thrown open and emergency floodlights illuminated the interior, casting long shadows that seemed to move independent of their sources. Even from my elevated position in the cab, I could see that the trailer floor was scorched black in places, covered with what looked like dozens of overlapping footprints burned into the metal. "Driver okay?" I managed to ask, though something told me I didn't want to hear the answer. The trooper's expression darkened. "Paramedics took him about an hour ago. Keeps talking about people walking around in his trailer, but the thing was locked up tight when we got here. Empty except for some old furniture covered in dust." He paused, rubbing his eye. "Weird thing is, the interior of that trailer got hot enough to scorch the floor, but there's no sign of fire, no electrical malfunction, no explanation for it." I thanked him and took the detour, but Tommy's trailer stayed with me as I wound through the mountain roads, following a route I'd never traveled before. The fog seemed to follow me, growing thicker as the road climbed higher, until I was navigating by nothing more than the yellow lines disappearing beneath my bumper and the occasional reflective sign emerging from the gray walls on either side. The detour led me through Pine Ridge, a small mountain community that looked like it had been abandoned sometime in the previous decade. Empty storefronts lined the main street, their dark windows reflecting my headlights, like watching eyes. The only sign of life was a single gas station with a flickering neon sign that read "Last Chance Fuel," though several of the letters had burned out, leaving it to spell latte. I pulled in to top off my tank and grabbed some coffee, hoping to shake the chill that had settled deep in my bones. The attendant was an elderly man with silver hair and hands that shook slightly as he rang up my purchase. His name tag read Earl in faded letters, and when he looked at me, his eyes held a knowledge that made me uncomfortable. "Don't see many big rigs come through on the Pine Ridge route," he said conversationally, but there was something probing in his tone. "Most drivers stick to the main highway unless something drives them off it." I paid for my coffee with cash, eager to get back on the road. "Accident on the Grapevine. Trooper recommended the detour." Earl nodded slowly, but his expression remained troubled. "Accident involving a big rig. Driver talking about things that weren't there." The question hit me like a physical blow, and I found myself staring at the old man with new attention. "How did you know that?" "Because it's been happening for years," Earl replied, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Always the same stretch of road, always drivers hauling empty trailers or picking up loads from certain lots. They see footprints burned into their trailer floors, feel the weight of people who aren't there." He leaned closer across the counter. "Some of them make it through okay, just shaken up. Others," he gestured vaguely toward the mountains, "others don't handle it so well." I left the gas station with more questions than answers, but Earl's words followed me back onto the dark road. The detour eventually reconnected with the main highway below the accident site, and I was able to resume my original route as the first hints of dawn began to penetrate the fog. The familiar rhythm of highway driving should have calmed my nerves, but I found myself constantly checking my mirrors, watching for signs of anything unusual. It wasn't until I reached the truck stop in Button Willow that I allowed myself to relax, pulling into a parking spot and shutting down my engine for a much-needed break. The morning sun had finally burned away most of the fog, and the world looked normal again. Other drivers grabbing showers and coffee, the familiar sounds of diesel engines and air brakes, the ordinary chaos of life on the road. I was walking back to my truck when I noticed something that made my blood freeze in my veins. Wet footprints led from my trailer doors to where I stood. Bare footprints that were too large and too numerous to have come from any single person. The prints were still damp despite the warm morning air, and they carried the metallic smell of scorched steel. The midnight rest that never ends. From Jake Morrison. "I've been driving these highways for 17 years now, hauling freight from coast to coast in my trusty Kenworth. You learn to read the road after that long, to sense which rest stops are safe, and which ones you should pass by, even when your eyes are burning and your back aches like fire. But there's one parking lot I stumbled into last winter that I still can't explain. One that's been haunting my dreams and making me question everything I thought I knew about time itself." The snow had been falling for hours, thick and heavy, turning the interstate into a treacherous ribbon of white. My windshield wipers were working overtime, their rhythmic thump-thump barely keeping pace with the accumulation. The heater was blasting, fogging up the side windows, and I could feel that familiar weight settling behind my eyelids that every long-haul driver knows all too well. I needed to stop, needed to rest, but the next truck stop wasn't for another 40 miles according to my GPS. That's when I saw the glow through the snow, soft blue light filtering through the storm, like a beacon. At first I thought it might be a gas station, or maybe one of those 24-hour diners that dot the lonely stretches of highway. As I got closer, the light resolved into the familiar fluorescent wash of a parking lot, the kind you'd find at any roadside establishment. There was a simple wooden sign barely visible through the swirling snow that read, "Midnight Rest, all welcome." The letters seemed to shimmer in my headlights, though that might have been fatigue playing tricks on my eyes. I could make out the dark silhouette of another semi near the far end, and what looked like a few cars and an RV closer to what appeared to be a small building at the center of the lot. The fluorescent lights mounted on tall poles cast everything in that peculiar blue-white glow that makes shadows look deeper and more menacing than they should. But it was shelter from the storm, and Lord knows I needed to get some sleep before I became a danger to myself and everyone else on the road. I pulled my rig into a spot near the middle of the lot, close enough to the other vehicles to feel some human presence, but far enough away to give my cargo trailer plenty of clearance. The moment I set the air brakes, an unusual quiet settled over everything. The storm was still raging outside. I could see the snow continuing to fall in thick curtains beyond my windshield, but I couldn't hear the wind anymore. Even the usual settling sounds my truck makes when I shut down the engine seemed muffled, as if the very air had grown thick and heavy. I climbed into my sleeper berth and tried to settle in for a few hours of rest, but something felt off about the whole place. Through my small side window, I could see the other vehicles clearly despite the storm, which struck me as odd. The snow should have been obscuring everything beyond a few yards, yet the entire parking lot remained visible under those strange blue lights. The fluorescent tubes themselves never seemed to flicker the way they normally do, burning with a steady, unwavering intensity that hurt my eyes when I looked directly at them. After tossing and turning for what felt like an hour, I decided to check my phone to see what time it was. The screen showed 11:47 p.m., which seemed about right given when I'd pulled in. I set an alarm for 5 in the morning and tried to sleep again, but my mind kept racing. There was something about the silence that bothered me deeply. Even in the middle of a snowstorm, there should have been some sound, some indication of the world continuing to move around me. Instead, there was nothing but an oppressive quiet that seemed to press against my eardrum. I must have dozed off eventually, because the next thing I knew, I was jolting awake with that disoriented feeling you get when you've been sleeping too deeply. My phone showed 11:47 p.m., exactly the same time as when I'd last checked it. I figured the display was frozen. Maybe the cold was affecting the battery, so I powered it off and back on. Still 11:47 p.m. That's when I noticed that my truck's digital clock showed the same thing. And my watch, and even the little travel clock I keep clipped to my sun visor. A creeping unease began to settle in my chest as I peered out through the windshield. The parking lot looked exactly the same as when I'd arrived. The snow was falling at precisely the same angle, the same thickness, creating identical patterns on the asphalt. The other vehicles were in exactly the same positions, covered with exactly the same amount of snow. Even their tire tracks looked fresh, as if they'd just arrived moments ago despite clearly having been there when I pulled in. I climbed out of my cab to get a better look around, and that's when the true strangeness of the place hit me. My boots should have crunched through several inches of fresh snow, but instead they landed on wet pavement with just a light dusting of flakes that seemed to disappear as soon as they touched the ground. The storm was still raging overhead. I could see the snow falling in the light of the fluorescent lamps, but none of it was actually accumulating. Walking closer to the other semi-truck, I could see it was an older Peterbilt with Oklahoma plates, its chrome bumper reflecting the blue light in patterns that seemed to shift and move even when I stood perfectly still. The driver's side window was fogged with condensation, suggesting someone was sleeping inside, but when I knocked gently on the door frame, there was no response. The sound of my knocking seemed to be absorbed by the air itself, producing barely a whisper despite my knuckles rapping firmly against the metal. The cars scattered around the lot were equally mysterious. A sedan with Illinois plates sat with its engine running, exhaust visible in the cold air, but when I looked through the windows, the interior was empty. The driver's seat was adjusted as if someone had just gotten out, and there was a coffee cup in the holder that was still steaming, but no sign of the person who might have left it there. A small SUV nearby had its hazard lights blinking in a steady rhythm that seemed to match my own heartbeat, though I couldn't see anyone inside that vehicle either. Its windows glowed with warm yellow light, and I could see shadows moving behind the curtains, suggesting a family inside going about their evening routine. But as I watched, I realized the shadows were repeating the exact same movements over and over again, like a film loop playing endlessly. A figure would move from left to right across one window, pause, then return in the opposite direction, only to repeat the journey again moments later. At the center of the parking lot sat a small building that I initially thought might be a convenience store or rest area facility. As I approached it, I could see it was older than I'd first realized, with weathered siding and windows that reflected the fluorescent light in strange ways. The glass seemed to ripple like water, distorting my reflection until I looked like something that wasn't quite human. A sign near the door read "Midnight Rest Station, Time for Weary Travelers," in faded letters that appeared to shift and change when I wasn't looking directly at them. Inside, the building seemed much larger than its exterior suggested, with aisles of shelves stretching back into shadows that the overhead lights couldn't quite penetrate. The shelves were stocked with typical road trip supplies, snacks, drinks, basic automotive supplies, but everything looked slightly wrong. The candy bars had familiar brand names, but the colors were off. The sodas had labels I almost recognized but not quite, and the bags of chips crinkled with a sound like whispered voices when I touched them. Behind the counter stood a figure I initially took for the attendant, but as my eyes adjusted to the dim interior lighting, I realized they weren't moving at all. They were frozen in place, hand reaching toward the cash register, mouth slightly open as if they'd been caught mid-sentence. Their eyes followed me as I moved through the store, but the rest of their body remained absolutely still, like a mannequin that had been posed mid-motion. Not the sharp blast of someone leaning on the horn, but a rhythmic pattern, 3 short honks, followed by 2 long ones, repeating over and over. I ran outside to find my Kenworth exactly as I'd left it, doors closed, no one in the cab, but the horn continuing its strange pattern. The sound seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once, as if the very air itself was honking. The Emerald Mile. From Jake Morrison. The thing about being a long-haul trucker for 37 years is that you develop instincts about cargo that go beyond what's written on the manifest. You learn to read the subtle signs, the way a trailer sits on its axles, the particular hum it makes rolling down the interstate, even the smell that seems to seep through supposedly sealed containers. So when I backed my Peterbilt up to that unmarked trailer at the Barstow Depot on a sweltering August night, every one of those instincts started whispering that something wasn't quite right about this particular load. The dispatcher, a nervous kid named Tony, who couldn't have been more than 25, handed me the paperwork with shaking fingers. In all my years of picking up freight, I'd never seen someone so eager to get a trailer off their lot. The manifest was sparse, just listed the cargo as industrial materials, with a delivery address in Portland, Oregon. No weight specifications, no hazmat warnings, no special handling instructions. Just those 2 vague words that could mean anything from factory equipment to chemical waste. As I ran through my pre-trip inspection, checking the trailer's lights and air lines, I noticed the first unusual thing about this load. The trailer itself looked standard enough. A 48-foot dry van, painted the usual industrial white, but there were modifications I'd never seen before. Extra vents had been installed along the sides, and what looked like some kind of monitoring equipment was mounted near the front. Cables ran from these devices into the trailer through sealed ports, suggesting whatever was inside needed constant observation. The real surprise came when I climbed back into my cab and started down the highway. As soon as the sun disappeared completely behind the mountains and true darkness settled over the Mojave Desert, I began to notice a faint green glow emanating from the trailer behind me. At first I thought it might be reflection from my own running lights, or maybe some kind of phosphorescent paint catching ambient light from passing vehicles. But as the traffic thinned out and the stretches between oncoming headlights grew longer, that eerie green radiance remained constant, casting strange shadows on the asphalt behind my rig. I pulled over at a truck stop near Bakersfield around midnight, partly to grab some coffee, but mostly to get a better look at whatever was causing that luminescence. Walking around to the back of the trailer, I could see the green light more clearly now. It wasn't coming from the outside surface, but seemed to be seeping through microscopic gaps in the trailer's construction. The light pulsed gently, like a massive heartbeat, growing brighter and dimmer in a rhythm that was almost hypnotic. When I pressed my ear against the trailer's back doors, I could hear something that made my blood run cold. A low humming sound, that seemed to resonate not just through the metal but through my bones themselves. Back in the cab, I tried to focus on the road ahead, but that green glow in my mirrors was impossible to ignore. Somewhere around Fresno, I started noticing that other drivers were reacting strangely to my rig. Normally, truckers acknowledge each other with friendly horn honks or flashing lights. But tonight, every driver I encountered seemed to speed up as soon as they got close enough to see my trailer clearly. One driver in a Kenworth even pulled alongside me and made frantic gestures toward his CB radio. But when I switched to channel 19, all I could hear was static filled with what sounded like whispered voices speaking in languages I didn't recognize. The strangest incident happened near Modesto, when I stopped at a way station that should have been closed at that hour. The building was dark and the scales were supposedly shut down, but as soon as my trailer rolled over the platform, every light in the facility blazed to light. The automated systems began running their inspection protocols completely on their own, and I watched through my side mirror as mechanical arms extended from hidden compartments to scan my trailer with devices I'd never seen before. The whole process took maybe 3 minutes. Then everything went dark again just as suddenly as it had activated. What had started as a faint glow was now bright enough to illuminate road signs and reflect off the chrome bumpers of passing cars. More disturbing was the way that light seemed to be affecting the local wildlife. I began seeing animals along the roadside that I'd never encountered in decades of driving this route. Creatures that looked almost familiar but somehow wrong, as if they were ordinary animals that had been subtly changed by exposure to whatever was radiating from my trailer. Near Stockton, I passed a field where dozens of cattle were gathered near the fence line closest to the highway. Every single one of them was facing my direction, and in the green glow cast by my cargo, I could see that their eyes were reflecting the light with an intensity that made them look like emeralds set in shadow. They began following my truck's progress along the fence, moving in perfect synchronization like some kind of bovine drill team responding to signals only they could perceive. Trucker after trucker was calling in reports of strange phenomena all along Interstate 5, electronics failing for no apparent reason, compasses spinning wildly, and several drivers claiming they'd seen what looked like the northern lights flickering in the southern sky. One old-timer with a voice I recognized from years of highway conversations was nearly in tears as he described watching his truck's headlights bend and curve like they were made of liquid light, rather than photons traveling in straight lines. By the time I reached Redding, around 4 in the morning, I was beginning to understand that whatever I was hauling wasn't just unusual. It was actively changing the environment around it. The green luminescence had grown so intense that it was creating its own weather patterns. Clouds were forming in an otherwise clear sky, swirling in unnatural spirals directly above my trailer. Lightning flickered within these clouds, but instead of the usual blue-white electrical discharge, these bolts pulsed with the same green energy that was emanating from my cargo. The real terror began in the mountains north of Redding, where the highway climbs through dense forests of pine and fir. As my truck labored up the steep grades, the trees on both sides of the road began responding to my passage in ways that defied everything I knew about plant behavior. Branches that should have been motionless in the still night air were bending toward my trailer as if drawn by some invisible force. More disturbing was the way the needles on these evergreens were beginning to glow with their own faint green phosphorescence, creating corridors of supernatural light that extended far back into the forest. Around Mount Shasta, I encountered my first real indication of just how dangerous this cargo might be. A California Highway Patrol officer had apparently been following me from a distance, probably called in by reports from other drivers about the strange light show my rig was creating. But when he finally got close enough to attempt a traffic stop, his patrol car's electrical systems failed catastrophically. I watched in my mirror as his headlights flickered and died, his emergency equipment went dark, and his engine simply stopped running. The cruiser coasted to a stop on the shoulder while sparks showered from under the hood, and I caught a glimpse of the officer stumbling out of his vehicle with what looked like severe disorientation. I wanted to stop and help, but something told me that getting any closer to that patrol car would only make things worse for the officer. Whatever was in my trailer seemed to be drawing energy from other sources, growing stronger with each mile we traveled. The green radiance was now so bright that it was washing out my own headlights, forcing me to navigate more by the phosphorescent glow than by conventional illumination. The pulsing rhythm had also changed, becoming faster and more irregular, like the heartbeat of something experiencing extreme stress or excitement. Near the Oregon border, I made a decision that probably saved my life. I pulled into a rest area and used the facility's payphone to call the number listed on my dispatch papers, intending to report the increasingly dangerous conditions and request emergency assistance. But when the call connected, instead of reaching a human voice, I heard only that same low humming sound I detected coming from the trailer, now accompanied by what sounded like hundreds of voices whispering in unison. The whispers were too faint to make out individual words, but their tone conveyed a sense of urgency and anticipation that made my skin crawl. As I hung up the phone and walked back toward my truck, I realized that the green glow was no longer confined to the trailer. It was spreading outward like fog, creeping across the parking lot and beginning to envelop nearby vehicles. A family sleeping in their RV started screaming as the light reached their windows, and I could see silhouettes moving frantically inside as they tried to start their engine and escape. Their diesel generator sputtered and died as the radiance touched their vehicle, leaving them stranded in the expanding field of supernatural energy.